Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. Sure, it's my pleasure to be able to consult you, High Priest Jurgula, said Lin Li. He didn't think that Jurgula had other intentions or plans to plot against him, so he agreed readily with a nod. The 24 stone pillars in the arena rose slowly around the field. The dense magewefts on the stone pillars also radiated magical light one after another, and soon, a transparent magic shield shrouded the field. Lin Li and Jurgula were already standing in the middle of the field, each holding a staff and waiting for the defensive mageweft to be fully activated in the arena. There was complete silence in the arena, and the werewolves, vampires, mages, and believers of darkness were all staring at the middle of the arena with excitement. Battles between high priests were rare, and only their respective disciples would be qualified to watch them. As for the young mage Lin Li, they had all heard about him in the past few days, and knew that he was the distinguished guest invited by Sendros, and that he was the owner of the Tower of Dusk in the Breezy Plains. They heard that he was a powerful legendary mage, and even though they were all in disbelief after hearing the news, they could not help but grow curious, since it concerned Chief High Priest Sendros. They, too, wanted to see what was so amazing about the young mage Lin Li. The 4 remaining high priests were talking to each other anxiously in the grandstand in front of the arena. Did Jurgula really just want to share his actual combat experience? That was one of the reasons, but not the only one. As a high priest of the Darkness Shrine, he definitely didn't want to spar with a guest of honor just because he was feeling an urge to practice. Zokila, is it really appropriate for Jurgula to do that? Sendros has warned us before, the vampire Kilostine asked with some concern. Although the 5 high priests were all members of the Darkness Council, they were all respectful to and fearful of Sendros. Especially when they thought about Sendros' means of dealing with rebels and those who violated the rules. Even the cold-blooded vampire could not help but feel a chill down his spine. It's just sparring and an exchange of experience, nothing too disrespectful. Besides, Master Felik is a willing party too. I doubt Sendros will hold it against us, Zokila said while hiding his face in the large hood, making it impossible for anyone to see his expression. However, his tone revealed the uneasiness within him. Don't scare yourself. After all, we're doing it for the Darkness Shrine. Besides, didn't you guys see that Mage Felik seems to be looking forward to the sparring session too? There's nothing too special about it. We're doing this for the sake of satisfying him too, said the werewolf high priest Palladio, who was rather nonchalant about it. After giving it some careful thought, the vampire felt that Palladio made sense too. Although Sendros' brutal means were frightening, he was not unreasonable. At the thought of this, the several high priests finally felt slightly relieved, and they shifted their attention to the center of the arena. At this moment, the defensive mageweft of the arena had already been activated completely, and the opponents finally moved after the 2 of them exchanged some polite words. Neither Jurgula nor Lin Li exhibited their respective magical domains. After all, it was just a friendly sparring session. Hence, there was no need to go all out. Besides, Lin Li really took it as a sparring session, and although Jurgula was not very satisfied with Lin Li's answer to his question, he did not dare to take Sendros' words lightly. However, Jurgula felt that even if he didn't go all out, it wouldn't be too difficult to defeat Lin Li. He felt that regardless of how great Lin Li's mastery of magic theory was, it did not mean that he could use his spells well. His mana was almost infinite, but that did not mean that he could use it appropriately. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been so many battles in this world. There would easily be a distinct winner once they compared each other's mastery of magic theory. As for experience and adventures, there wasn't a clear winner. Besides, the environment of the Darkness Shrine was similar to a darkness domain, which allowed the strength of the believers of darkness to greatly improve. Jurgula initially had level 23 power, but with the help of dark magic, his power was probably great enough for him to rival a level 24 powerhouse. Jurgula thought that the only thing he had to do was to make sure Mage Felik would not lose too badly to protect the pride of the latter. Be careful, Mage Felik, Jurgula specially reminded. He pointed his staff forward, and a shadow formed at Lin Li's feet. There were some ripples at Lin Li's feet, and it was as if the ground had turned into black water. There were then black tentacles like giant pythons that emerged from the ground and intertwined around Lin Li's body. Upon hearing Georgila's reminder, Lin Li almost couldn't recover from the shock. Is this a new battle tactic? It might just be a sparring session, but he doesn't have to be so friendly and polite, Lin Li thought as he raised the Helios scepter and pointed it toward the ground gently. A ball of flames immediately spread outwards, using his body as a central point. Resistance Ring of Fire was a very effective spell that mages could use when they were being besieged. The black tentacles that were moving toward Lin Li were suddenly pushed away from Lin Li by the Resistance Ring of Fire, which caused them to melt quickly. Immediately after casting the Resistance Ring of Fire, Lin Li immediately waved the Helios scepter and caused a ray of thunderbolt to condense, after which it immediately crashed into Georgila's head. Georgila was not surprised by the fact that there were no effects of using the shadow. If Lin Li couldn't even counter that, how could he be respected and valued by Sendros? Georgila shifted his footsteps swiftly, and while giving himself an additional shield, he seemed to have become a shadow. At this moment, the pillar of thunderbolt seemed to have landed too. However, it caused numerous ripples to form in the ground. Lin Li squinted a little. The Darkness Guardian was a legendary level defensive spell, and its effects seemed rather similar to those of Void of the Stars. Of course, it was much worse. It was said that the mages who mastered the Void of the Stars would be able to place their body and soul in the Void of the Stars, and no longer be hurt by the magic spells and weapons. Actually, under the effect of the Void of the Stars, the caster would definitely become an existence that no longer belonged to Amrel, and thus would not be susceptible to damage by humans. The Darkness Guardian would cause the caster's body to become a shadow with extremely high immunity to physical damage and damage done by elemental spells. Swords had never been able to attack shadows. Besides, there was a special feature of Darkness Guardian which allowed the caster to move freely in the naturally occurring shadows. If the caster was completely in the dark, it would almost be the same as teleportation. However, the greatest weakness of the Darkness Guardian was that it would greatly reduce the caster's resistance to holy light magic. When the caster was under the protection of the Darkness Guardian, he could probably be injured by a holy light spell of the lowest level despite being in the legendary level. Hence, dark mages would definitely refrain from using Darkness Guardian when battling with the clergyman of holy light, for that would be akin to letting the opponent kill them. When Lin Li was in the Brilliant Shrine, he had not only read the Light Bible, but also received the personal guidance of Pope Rosario. Hence, he definitely wasn't inferior to the clergyman in terms of holy light magic. According to Archbishop Los, Lin Li's attainments in holy light magic were enough for him to qualify for a cardinal's position. However, in the face of Georgila's Darkness Guardian, Lin Li didn't use any holy light magic. One reason for that was that he was, after all, in the Darkness Shrine. Hence, using holy light magic there would definitely make others detest him. Another reason was that they were just sparring, after all, and Lin Li didn't really want to win. He didn't want the battle to end too soon, either. Moreover, the use of holy light magic during the sparring session would be rather suspicious, and even if he were to win, he would win because of an unfair advantage. Well, I have no means to deal with you just because I'm not using holy light magic. Lin Li thought to himself with a smirk, after which he darted to the side quickly, avoiding the thorns of the shadow. At the same time, he raised the Helios scepter while chanting a spell, causing the gemstone at the top of the scepter to emit a dazzling ray of light. All of a sudden, the temperature in the arena seemed to have plunged drastically as plenty of snowflakes condensed in the void with specks of glitter. They then floated downwards and caused the entire arena to be covered in snow. It was not Lin Li's frost domain, but a level 22 ice element realm magic that was similar to thunderstorm disaster. He actually used a spell of this level at this juncture. Does he really have infinite mana? Asked Georgila, rather shocked, just like the other 4 high priests, who were also taken aback. Theoretically, a mage should have the ability to cast magic spells that corresponded to their respective levels. Since Lin Li was a level 23 legendary mage, it wasn't surprising that he'd be able to use level 22 spells. However, that did not mean that he could use them casually like they were fireballs, especially since realm magic as such would consume mana rapidly. It would be a huge burden even for a level 23 mage. However, the four high priests could tell that Lin Li seemed very relaxed when casting the spell, and didn't seem to pause at all when he was accumulating mana. In other words, the mana required by this level 22 spell could be put out by Lin Li immediately, and didn't have to be accumulated in Lin Li's body beforehand. Based on that alone, the four high priests began to believe that Lin Li's mana was almost infinite, just like what Sendros had told them. At this moment, a priest scurried onto the viewing deck. After bowing, he said to the four high priests, "Sirs, the chief high priest would like you to see him now." "What?" The four high priests sprung up in shock. Although they had already thought of an excuse beforehand, they still panicked when they heard that Sendros wanted to see them. Of course, Sendros wouldn't really skin them alive, though he would definitely teach them a lesson. "Just the four of us?" "He didn't mention High Priest Jurgula?" Zokila asked as he calmed down, seemingly having thought of something. "Yes, the chief high priest only mentioned that he'd like to see the four of you." "He didn't mention High Priest Jurgula," the priest hurriedly answered. "Zokila, why did you ask that question?" the knight Nostolo asked loudly. "Nothing much, that just means that the chief has probably given his silent consent to the sparring session. Otherwise, he would have summoned Jurgula too, and not allowed the two of them to continue sparring in the arena," Zokila explained to Nostolo and the rest after heaving a sigh of relief. An ordinary mage tower would use crystal balls for surveillance and monitoring purposes, what more the darkness shrine. In fact, every slight change and movement in the shrine would immediately appear on the crystal ball at the core of the shrine. Although Sendros couldn't possibly stay in front of the crystal ball at all times, he would definitely take a look since the strongest defensive mageweth had been activated. If Sendros had really been displeased with the behavior of the five high priests, he would have stopped the sparring session immediately instead of asking to see the four of them. Upon hearing Zokila's explanation, the other three were finally relieved, but they would still clearly get reprimanded. The four of them glanced at the arena, and noticed that the two there were launching their attacks and casting their respective spells while having a whale of a time. They wondered how Sendros would deal with Jurgula, but could only sigh deep down and leave the grandstand together. Jurgula, who was in the arena, had no idea that his peers had all been summoned to see Sendros, because his opponent Lin Li left him with no room to pay attention to other matters. He could already sense that Lin Li wasn't lying or boasting at all. After launching the level 22 spell, he continued to launch another spell that consumed massive amounts of mana. If he had been an ordinary level 23 legendary mage, he would probably have gassed out a long time ago. What made Jurgula even more daunted was Lin Li's incredible casting speed. For legendary magic, the casting speed would not increase linearly with the chanting speed, as mana output was also an important factor. It was just like filling a bucket of water, even if the tap was turned to the fullest, it would still take time to fill the bucket with water. If an ordinary mage's mana output was like a water pipe, Lin Li's would be like an endless stream from a river. If he didn't have to chant a spell and sort the elements, he could probably launch his legendary spells instantaneously. The arena was completely covered in ice and snow. A sun-like fireball suddenly appeared above the arena, lighting it up. Due to the reflection, there was suddenly no shadow in the arena at all. Jurgula, who used the Darkness Guardian, was forced out of the shadows. The second disadvantage of the Darkness Guardian was that there would be no guardian without darkness. Of course, in principle, there was darkness everywhere in the world. However, they were in the arena, and creating a small area without shadows was still feasible. If they were outside, Jurgula would still be able to dash into the area outside the arena and defeat his opponents using the Darkness Guardian. However, he had no choice but to appear here. Otherwise, he would be admitting defeat. A legendary magic spell was actually used as a light source, making Jurgula feel extremely infuriated, almost to the point of vomiting blood. Of course, even if he really wanted to vomit blood, he wouldn't be able to, because his body was just like a dry skeleton. At this moment, before he could even react, Countless powerful magic spells had already swept over him like a storm. In the grandstands of the arena, the believers of darkness were all completely frightened. Everyone held their breath and watched the intense battle going on in the arena. None of them dared to make a single sound at all. Right from the beginning, when Lin Li and Georgila walked into the arena, everyone had already deduced the outcome of the battle. Even though Lin Li was an honored guest of High Priest Sendros, they felt that he was way too young. Indeed, becoming a legendary mage at such a young age was an impressive feat. However, experience came with time, and the lack of experience could never be compensated for by talent. However, the believers of darkness in the grandstands knew that the lack of experience would be negated when one had formidable power. Even though some of the powerful magic spells were unknown to others, they could tell from the ripples around the defensive spells in the arena that the power was absolutely daunting. Regardless of who the victor of the battle would be, High Priest Georgila had clearly lost the upper hand, and they obviously didn't have to guess anything. However, Lin Li did not want to end the battle too quickly, because he still remembered that it was a sparring session, and he also wanted to learn more about dark magic through it. Hence, even though the magic storm seemed rather terrifying, he had always been trying to find a balance so as to allow Georgila to continue persisting and have the ability to retaliate. Darkness is eternal, and everything in this world will eventually belong to the darkness. Georgila exclaimed as he slammed his staff into the ground, causing the white snow to suddenly turn black as if it had been stained by black ink. The magic storm that struck after that also lost its color all of a sudden after entering the domain of black snow. It was then drowned in the infinite darkness as if it had never even existed. Eternal darkness? That's probably the dark magic spell that's noted down in the dark magic scriptures. Seeing that all the spells had disappeared peculiarly, Lin Li rejoiced instead of feeling surprised, and his eyes even glistened with excitement. Although he had never deliberately researched dark magic before, he had some understanding of the various types of dark magic in the world. Besides, Lin Li couldn't remember the eternal darkness spell that Georgila had just used. Apart from the dark magic scriptures, Lin Li couldn't think of another possible source of that spell. Besides, Lin Li didn't sense many magical waves when Georgila was casting the spell just now. Instead, he seemed to have sensed a holy aura that was similar to holy light magic. That made him further confirm his guess. Most people would immediately think of evilness at the mention of darkness. However, darkness did not necessarily mean evilness, even though evilness often lurked in darkness. After all, the Brilliance Shrine and the Darkness Shrine used to be a family. Since the Brilliance Shrine had holy light magic, the Darkness Shrine definitely had something similar. Although the crisis at hand was resolved immediately, Georgila was still lamenting in agony deep down because eternal darkness couldn't be used freely and casually. Although he managed to use it to engulf and consume Lin Li's magic storm, it took up plenty of his mana. The amount of mana consumed by eternal darkness would be the same as the amount of mana drained from his body. How much mana does this crazy mage have? He thought. Georgila was completely convinced by Lin Li's abilities. In the Darkness Shrine, he was definitely on par with a level 24 legendary mage, but being in this environment, he had no upper hand at all when he was facing the level 23 legendary mage Lin Li. In fact, he even came off slightly worse. Although the situation seemed to obviously be advantageous to him, he still ended up in a state where he almost had no means to retaliate. That just meant that Lin Li was way more competent than him. However, Georgila didn't want to admit defeat now, and there were still numerous believers of darkness in the grandstands. Back then, he was still thinking about how he should save some face for Lin Li, and yet he was the one being embarrassed now. While Georgila was caught in a dilemma, the 4 high priests who had been summoned by Sendros were standing in front of a huge crystal ball, and watching everything that was happening in the arena. They watched as Georgila was about to be forced out of the Darkness Guardian while being bombarded by Lin Li's magic storm. They also saw how Georgila had no choice but to resort to using eternal darkness. Although Lin Li's magic storm disappeared in eternal darkness, Zokila and the rest knew that there was already an outcome. "Have you guys forgotten what I said?" Sendros questioned with his back facing them while staring at the images displayed in the crystal ball. Although his tone was calm, his heart was filled with shock because of Lin Li's abilities. Well, that's just a sparring session between Jurgula and Master Felik. We're not being rude to him. Besides, Master Felik is also very happy to exchange and share his experience in actual combat with Jurgula, Zokila answered anxiously. Humph, I know exactly what you guys are thinking. Are you reassured now? Asked Sendros. He was not angry. After all, the 5 high priests were just worried about the fate of the Darkness Shrine. This time, they indeed didn't show any disrespect to Lin Li, either. Yes, Master Felik's abilities are indeed impressive. I believe he'll definitely be of great help to us, Zokila and the rest quickly answered, but they were still rather reserved. They simply said that Lin Li would be of help, and did not mention that they would be willing to rely completely on him. Forget it. In order to avoid letting such things happen again, I'd better reveal some information to you. Do you think that I value him greatly only because he's a level 23 legendary mage and a pharmaceutics guru, and because of the power of the Tower of Dusk? Let me tell you, I'm very certain that he's the person the Darkness Shrine has been looking for, exclaimed Sendros, who wanted to give them a sense of relief lest they end up stirring trouble while he was away. Lin Li probably wouldn't care if they were to do it once or twice, but if they were to continue, Lin Li would probably teach them a lesson. What? He's the one we've been looking for? How can that be? There isn't a trace of darkness on him at all. Zokila and the rest were flabbergasted and in extreme disbelief, so much more than when Sendros said those words beforehand. Do you really think I'd joke about such matters? Sendros barked, causing their discussion to cease. He continued, in the next few days, I will be going to the Eternal Darkness altar to check and verify some matters. I hope I won't hear of you guys doing any disrespectful things to him when I'm back, otherwise, you will all become the sinners of the Darkness Shrine. You are dismissed. The 4 high priests left the room with complicated expressions, and while walking towards the arena, they slowly tried to recover from the shock Sendros' words had brought them. They knew that there was no need to doubt Sendros' words, but they just couldn't convince themselves to believe them. If Lin Li were to really be the person the Darkness Shrine had been looking for all this while, he would then very likely be able to rescue them from the crisis this time. However, the problem was that they were high priests, and thus should be very sensitive to the aura of darkness, yet they didn't find a single trace of darkness on Lin Li at all, right from the beginning where they saw him until now, when he fought Jurgula. How could that be explained? Filled with doubts, the 4 high priests finally arrived at the arena, but at this moment, silence was already restored. The believers of darkness on the grandstands had already left. Lin Li and Jurgula were the only ones left. They were seated together and discussing various details of the battle just now. Zokila, Palladio. Where have you guys been? Jurgula asked, feeling an ominous hunch when he saw the 4 of them. He had no idea when they'd left, but he knew that something was up since the 4 of them had left together. After all, the sparring session was meant for testing Lin Li's abilities. The thing now was the most important. We went to see High Priest Sendros, and discussed some matters. How was the sparring session with Master Felik? Zokila asked, even though it was obvious. However, he seemed to be hinting to Jurgula that Sendros was no longer holding it against him. Jurgula secretly sighed, turned his head to look at Lin Li, and said with awe, Master Felik, your abilities are really impressive. I've really benefited a lot this time. I hope to have the opportunity to consult you again in the future. What convinced him was the fact that Lin Li still gave him an out in the end by making the battle end in a tie. He was both comfortable and convinced with Lin Li. You're being too polite and modest, High Priest Jurgula. Your accomplishments in dark magic have also given me a lot of insight. I hope I can consult you about dark magic in the future, Lin Li said humbly. Lin Li and Jurgula then discussed magic, while Zokila and the rest joined in. However, apart from Jurgula, who was clueless about the situation, they started to scrutinize Lin Li even more carefully. In fact, Lin Li didn't gain much from sparring with Jurgula, but he did learn a lot during the discussion with the 5 high priests who were all powerhouses who used dark force. Although the werewolf Palladio and the dark knight Nostolo did not use dark magic, their power also came from dark force, and they could give Lin Li a better understanding of dark force in another sense. After a pleasant conversation, Lin Li got up to bid the 5 high priests goodbye. He decided to go back and combine his newly learned knowledge with the concepts that he had picked up from the Book of Eternity, so as to digest everything he had learned today. However, just as he was about to leave, he was stopped by High Priest Zokila. He asked in confusion, "High Priest Zokila, what's the matter?" Zokila hesitated for a moment, and finally made up his mind to bring it up. "Master Felek, I reckon you've seen enough of the Darkness Shrine in the past 2 days. However, there's still a place that you definitely won't want to miss left. If you're willing, why don't I show you around tomorrow?" "Oh? Wouldn't it be a little too troublesome?" asked Lin Li, who noticed that Zokila seemed to have made up his mind. In fact, Lin Li reckoned that the only place that he had yet to visit in the Darkness Shrine was probably the place where all the books of the Darkness Shrine were kept. Of course, that was definitely an extremely important place to the Darkness Shrine. Zokila was probably hesitant and in a dilemma because of that. "No, not all," Zokila said as he shook his head profusely. However, his large had made it look like there was some breeze blowing past. However, the other 4 high priests had already focused their attention on Zokila. Others couldn't notice the shock on their faces, because their faces were special. Even till now, Lin Li still didn't know why Sendros had invited him to the Darkness Shrine. Hence, he naturally wouldn't consider too much. He said, "Sure. I'll have to trouble you tomorrow then, High Priest Zokila." He then bade goodbye to them and left the arena. After Lin Li left, the 4 high priests finally couldn't bear it any longer, but Jurjula was the first to question them. He initially had no idea what Sendros had said to Zokila and the rest, but after hearing their replies, Zokila, who was already convinced with Lin Li's abilities, similarly looked to be in disbelief. While Jurjula was digesting the news and feeling astonished, the werewolf, vampire, and the Black Knight surrounded Jurjula and questioned him. "Zokila, where were you referring to when you spoke to Mage Felek? Could it be?" Kulostine asked worriedly. In fact, as a high priest, he had already guessed it vaguely. However, he was still in disbelief, and dared not believe that Zokila would be so bold. "Yeah, isn't this an opportunity to confirm the identity of Mage Felek?" Zokila asked, seemingly intending to go all out as well. "Sendros just mentioned it to us a short while ago. Have you forgotten it already? I think we might as well accompany Mage Felek for a few more sparring sessions in the next few days. Maybe we'd be able to tell something," said the werewolf high priest Palladio, who was much more cautious than the other 2 who were into magic. "Yes, we shouldn't doubt Sendros' words," the Black Knight, Nostolo said in a rough voice. Faced with the persuasion of his peers, Zokila shook his head, and said, "No, this idea is not as bad as you guys think." Sendros was rather conservative with his words, so that means that he isn't too sure about Mage Felek's identity, either. If we can confirm his identity, we would be giving Sendros great help. He won't blame us for this. Besides, even if it turns out that Mage Felek isn't that person, there wouldn't be anything wrong with what we did. Well, after hearing Zokila's explanation, the other 4 high priests remained silent. They had no choice but to admit that Zokila's words still seemed very reasonable. Now that the Darkness Shrine was in a crisis that the believers of darkness did not know about, the high priests would have to be concerned about it. If they got it right, they would be doing Sendros a favor, but if they were wrong, it would only be Lin Li's misfortune. Although it would be good to forge connections with Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk, no one could be bothered about that now. On the following morning, which was yet another one that did not resemble daybreak, Sendros went to the Eternal Darkness altar, while Zokila brought Lin Li to a rather remote place deep inside the Darkness Shrine. "Were you referring to this place?" Lin Li asked, while staring at the view in front of him peculiarly, only to see an ancient gate that had a magical barrier in the middle, on which there seemed to be water ripples. Lin Li thought that Zokila would take him to a place where all the books of the Darkness Shrine were kept. However, the place in front of him didn't look like a library at all. "Master Felek, please rest assured. You are the most distinguished guest of the Darkness Shrine, and although this is a forbidden place for other believers of darkness, you are definitely qualified to enter this place. All of us, including Sendros, come here to get some enlightenment about the darkness laws. Please come with me, Zokila said as he walked towards the gate. Lin Li thought, he probably wouldn't hurt me, I don't seem to have any feud with this necromancer, and I was invited to the darkness shrine by Sendros. Since Sendros and the rest come here to be enlightened about the laws of darkness, it should be the same as a darkness canon. After Zokila entered through the gate, Lin Li stroked his chin and paced back and forth in front of the gate before finally deciding to go in and take a look. Lin Li had the debris of the star's gloomy dark, which contained the purest darkness nomological power. However, just like a mage apprentice who had an advanced magic book, Lin Li had needed a long and arduous process to find some clues and information from the book even though he could figure out some things. Moreover, his knowledge was still limited and incomplete. Hence, mage apprentices had to build and strengthen their foundation in magic by reading some basic books about magic in order to study advanced magic books better. What Lin Li needed the most now was basic knowledge about the laws of darkness so that he could better understand the laws while gaining a better understanding of gloomy dark. That was also why he studied theurgy at the Brilliant Shrine. However, Lin Li began to regret it as soon as he stepped through the gate. The high priest Zokila who had entered first had long disappeared, and Lin Li looked around to realize that it was a completely different world. There was soft and dense grass beneath his feet, but the grass was black. There were wild flowers blooming in the grass, but they were also black, just like the dense forest in the distance where the trees were black. The sky was black, and so was the entire world. If it weren't for his understanding of the laws of darkness, Lin Li wouldn't be able to see anything at this moment. Damn it, what kind of a damned place is this? What is that disgraceful Zokila trying to do? Lin Li cursed. However, he had no choice but to walk forward because the door behind him was long gone as well. When he first entered, Lin Li still felt that he had a chance of getting off scot-free, but after he walked for a while and stopped in his tracks, he knew that he had definitely been duped, for he saw around him countless all-black magical beasts, which would look like vivid sketches against a white background. Shadow creatures, this is the damned Shadow Realm. Lin Li finally thought of a place that was the most disgusting version of the Endless World and a parallel of the world of Amril in Legends. It was the Shadow Realm. Just like the world of the undead, the Shadow Realm was dependent on Amril, but it was also relatively independent and composed of relatively individual world laws at the same time. By using the Tide of Death, a necromancer would be opening a door to the world of the undead, and the undead creatures would swarm out in armies while feeding off of the aura of life in Amril. Otherwise, the decaying bones in Amril alone would never form terrifying combat power. The difference between the Shadow Realm and the world of the undead was that the shadow creatures couldn't leave the Shadow Realm, even though they were much stronger than the undead creatures. Even the most common shadow magical beast was at least level 10. However, a single ray of light would be lethal to shadow creatures. After the shadow creatures appeared around Lin Li, the first thing Lin Li thought of was the holy light magic. However, he got a great shock after giving it a try. The entire Shadow Realm seemed to have a force that would prevent all light from appearing. In the Shadow Realm, it was impossible for Lin Li to even release a small fireball, let alone use holy light magic. It could be said that any magic related to light was forbidden by the powerful world laws there. Magic was not the only aspect restricted. Lin Li took out the Helios scepter in a bid to cast a bunch of stones, because he thought that stones had nothing to do with light. However, when he induced mana into Helios scepter, he discovered that the Helios scepter had also lost its function. It seemed that the introduction of man would make the gemstone on Helios scepter glow and emit light. Hence, that behavior was also prohibited by the world laws. Lin Li had no choice but to put away the Helios scepter and throw some rocks with his bare hands, after which countless huge black stones suddenly smashed into the surrounding beasts. However, although the spell was cast successfully, the damage done to those shadow creatures was extremely limited. One reason was the incredible agility of the shadow creatures, while the other was that the shadow creatures were highly resistant to magic and physical attacks alike. If they were struck by boulders, they would still be able to get up after rolling around unless they were hit in the head. Lin Li's attack obviously angered the surrounding magical beasts. Although they had long wanted to rip Lin Li, the outsider, apart, his provocation made them furious. They didn't roar, and instead pounced on Lin Li silently, from all sides like trained assassins. Lin Li could not distinguish between the different types of shadow creatures, and only knew that there were different forms like wolves, lions, and tigers, and most of them could not be identified by their appearance. Moreover, he did not care to distinguish them, because he couldn't launch his elemental shield anyway. Hence, he had no other choice but to evade the attacks using his own body. It was extremely dangerous. In fact, there were also defensive spells for earth magic. If one were to simply use stone armor, which had poor defensive power, he would cause himself to become the target of those shadow creatures. Fortunately, Lin Li had read through some books about dark magic when he headed back after the fight with Jurjula. He immediately thought of the dark shadow armor used in dark magic. Damn it, do you really think I can't do anything about you? Try this then. Lin Li used the dark shadow armor to temporarily resist the attacks of the shadow creatures. With the end of a chant for a spell, he pushed his hands forward forcefully, and caused a black ice ball to fly towards the beasts. Ice seemed to be shiny and glistening, but there was no light in this world of darkness to be reflected off of the ice ball. Hence, it was not prohibited by the world laws. The black ice ball flew towards the herd of magical beasts while spinning and continuously releasing ice cones. The ice ball was a legendary level magic spell. Regardless of how defensive the shadow magical beasts were, they were just like fragile paper in front of legendary magic spells. As the ice cones were launched, they collapsed in the blink of an eye. The ending explosion of the ice ball caused a vacuum zone to appear instantly amongst the beasts. The 10-odd ice balls finally repelled the shadow creatures, but Lin Li wasn't relieved, because those shadow magical beasts were obviously the lowest level creatures of the shadow realm, and there were probably more powerful creatures, such as the shadow wyrm in legends. The worst things tended to always happen. Lin Li's worries soon became reality as the shadow magical beasts that had been wandering in the distance seemed to have gotten a fright and fled. There was then a massive oppression in the air, and Lin Li looked into the sky, only to see 3 shadow creatures in the form of wyrm, just as he expected. They were all flying towards him, approaching from afar. Shadow wyrms were said to be the descendants of the survivors amongst the ancient wyrms, which had fled to the shadow realm in the late prehistoric times, and the shadow creatures. Lin Li had no idea how strong the strongest shadow wyrm was, but it was still a descendant of the wyrms, after all, and wouldn't be weaker than the wyrms of Amril. He could only be thankful for the fact that none of the 3 shadow wyrms were at the sanctuary realm, and should have just reached level 20. In the blink of an eye, the 3 shadow wyrms had already flown above Lin Li's head, and as soon as they arrived, they began blowing black flames, their dragon breath, at Lin Li. However, they weren't exactly black flames, because the black flames of shadow wyrms were not meant for burning the souls of their enemies, but for turning them into shadows. In other words, once Lin Li was sprayed with their dragon breath, he wouldn't have to think about leaving, because he could only stay in the shadow realm forever in the form of a shadow. Even if he were to make it out, he would die instantly. Lin Li didn't want to stay in this dark place forever. Hence, he tried to dodge the black flames by using his power of flight to fly straight into the air, after which he shot an ice ball at the 3 shadow wyrms. However, they were clearly even more magic resistant because of their form. The legendary level ice ball wasn't lethal to them, even though it did cause some damage. Since he couldn't use the Helioscepter, and his usage of magic was also limited, even his eyes would have become completely useless had he not had some understanding of the laws of darkness. Fortunately, there were only 3 level 20 shadow wyrms. Although Lin Li couldn't kill them, he would still be able to neutralize the danger they posed. While dealing with the 3 shadow wyrms, Lin Li thought about how he could leave the horrendous place as soon as possible. Obviously, there was a world law that would prohibit all light, but compared to the perfect rules of Amril, the laws here seemed to be of the level of magical domains, just that this magical domain was much stronger. At the thought of this, Lin Li felt that the shadow realm seemed to be somewhat similar to the seven-realm spiral. Otherwise, the shadow creatures definitely wouldn't be that weak. In order to leave this world, Lin Li could choose to either go through the gate again or seize control of the laws of this world. However, the gate was out of bounds, and seizing control of the laws didn't seem that feasible either. Lin Li naturally had some control over the laws of darkness since he could create the light and darkness domain. However, at this moment, he clearly felt that the laws of this world were far beyond his control. Only a sanctuary master would be able to create the seven-realm spiral. Since the shadow realm was similar to the seven-realm spiral, it had to have sanctuary-level laws. If he could exert the power of the debris of the stars, nothingness, he could probably try to break through the space, but unfortunately, he was still far from that level. At the thought of the debris of the stars, Lin Li's eyes suddenly lit up. Indeed, he couldn't control the world laws of this realm, but gloomy dark symbolized the purest form of laws of darkness, and should be able to override the laws of this world. Although he owned gloomy dark, and only had limited control over it, he could just put gloomy dark away after the laws of gloomy dark replaced the laws of this world. Without nomological power, there would be no way for this world to continue existing, and he would then be able to leave. At the thought of this, Lin Li did not dare to hesitate at all, and simply took out the debris of the star's gloomy dark. When gloomy dark appeared in this world, Lin Li had yet to use his mental strength to activate it when it had already emanated a massive amount of power, which was far beyond the power that it had when Lin Li used it. With the eruption of gloomy dark, the entire shadow realm seemed to stagnate for a while, and the three shadow WYRMs froze in the air all of a sudden. As the power of gloomy dark increased bit by bit, the three WYRMs actually began to quiver and fall onto the ground one by one. They put their wings away and leaned forward as if they were worshipping gloomy dark. When the power of the eruption of gloomy dark reached its peak, the three shadow WYRMs began to crumble and collapse as pure dark force poured out of their bodies and surged into gloomy dark. Lin Li could also clearly feel that even the shadow magical beasts that had already fled far, far away had also become pure dark force that was surging towards gloomy dark in his hands. Lin Li didn't know how much dark force gloomy dark had consumed, but he closed his eyes and used the opportunity to release all of his mental strength while gloomy dark was suppressing the world laws of this realm. He carefully tried to experience the laws of darkness in detail. In fact, this was not the first time Lin Li had ever done that. In the seven-realm spiral, Lin Li had also used this method to gain a lot of insight into various nomological powers. Hence, he didn't take up much time this time, and managed to make all of the experience deeply etched in his mind rather quickly. He also managed to summon back gloomy dark, which had completely replaced the world laws. As gloomy dark was placed in the ring of endless storm, Lin Li immediately felt a force of repulsion suddenly descend on his body, and he abruptly felt that he didn't belong to this world. Before he could even react, he suddenly felt dizzy. Next, he realized that he was already standing in the darkness shrine with the ancient gate behind him, as if he had really just passed through the gate. Lin Li also saw Zokila, who had brought him there, standing at the gate together with the four other high priests. Since he was in a good mood because of the new insights into the laws of darkness that he had obtained inside, he decided not to hold it against them for sending him into the shadow realm. However, just as Lin Li walked over to Zokila and the rest, and was about to say something, Zokila spoke to Lin Li in a tone of surprise, but the words he said made the joy on Lin Li's face vanish immediately. "Master Felix, you actually made it out unharmed. Seems like you are indeed the incarnation of the god of darkness," Zokila exclaimed in surprise. Although the four high priests had their faces obscured, it seemed that their joy was noticeable too. Those words were what made Lin Li's face grow sullen. It was obvious what he meant. Zokila had led him to the shadow realm, but he clearly hadn't done it simply for the sake of letting Lin Li gain some insight into the laws of darkness. Instead, he had been trying to test something to verify Lin Li's identity. Lin Li was not interested in the incarnation of the god of darkness, and he only knew that if he hadn't had gloomy dark, he would have definitely died in the shadow realm. "I'm sorry, High Priest Zokila, but I'm not an incarnation of anyone. Sorry to disappoint you," Lin Li said before turning around to leave without taking another look at them. Staring at Lin Li while he left, Zokila and the rest could not help but look at each other in dismay. In their opinion, the incarnation of the god of darkness was an extremely honorable identity, yet Lin Li looked extremely unhappy and full of resentment after hearing the news. However, after confirming Lin Li's identity, the 5 high priests were too overjoyed to consider other issues. However, when the 5 high priests walked out together happily, and even wanted to report to Sendros and break the good news to him, they saw Sendros walking towards them, and a cold chill was sent down each of their spines, dampening their spirits and killing their joy. High Priest Sendros, you are back. We happen to have good news for you, Zokila hurriedly said to Sendros. Good news? Do you guys still take me seriously? What did I tell you before? Can you people use your brains before deciding to do anything? Yes, Zokila, Jurgila, and Nostalo, you 3 are already brainless, but what about the other 2? Are you guys idiots too? Sendros hollered in exasperation, wishing he could turn the 5 of them into undead creatures of the lowest level. Sendros initially went to the Eternal Darkness altar today, but before he could even observe anything there, he began to sense something amiss going on in the Darkness Shrine. When he felt the changes in the Shadow Realm, he immediately thought of what might have happened, and so hurried back from the Eternal Darkness altar. However, something had clearly already happened. If it had been someone else and not Lin Li, Sendros probably wouldn't have been that infuriated, but knowing Lin Li's personality well, he knew that they were in huge trouble. High Priest, we can already confirm the identity of Master Felek. Isn't this a good thing? Zokila asked, while trying to suppress his fear. Good thing? We have to make him stay to help us. Are you guys trying to send the Darkness Shrine into a dead end by doing what you've just done? Sendros berated in fury. Him becoming the incarnation of the God of Darkness would be a very beneficial thing for him and for the Tower of Dusk. How could he refuse it? The 5 high priests couldn't figure it out at all, because the matter was definitely worth rejoicing for anyone. They couldn't think of a reason for Lin Li to turn it down. What if he isn't? Were you planning to let him die inside? If someone else took your life as a stake for a gamble, what would you think of them? Would you still be willing to help that person? Seeing that the rest were about to speak again after he berated them, Sendros waved his hands to stop them. Cut the crap. Go and apologize to him now. Let's hope it's not too late. Otherwise, you shall think about the consequences you have to bear. The 5 high priests did not oppose apologizing. After all, they felt that Lin Li was the incarnation of the God of Darkness, hence, there was nothing to feel indignant about. However, they didn't think that this matter would make Lin Li react so intensely, because the identity of the incarnation of the God of Darkness was supreme in the Darkness Shrine. And even Sendros, who had always been helming the Darkness Shrine, would be slightly inferior to him. Under the lead of Sendros, the group hurried to the place where Lin Li was putting up in. When they saw that Lin Li was still in the room, they felt slightly relieved. However, they immediately panicked again with looks of dismay after hearing Lin Li's first words. Master Sendros, you're back. Well, I've been here at the Darkness Shrine as a guest for some time. I'd like to bid you goodbye. Thank you for the hospitality you've shown me in the past few days, Lin Li said politely, without any anger on his face on seeing Sendros and the rest of them enter. Master Felek, how can you leave so soon? You have only been here for a few days. If you're upset about something, feel free to let me know, Sendros said anxiously. It seems that you already know about it. I don't want to help someone who tried to kill me. However, you can rest assured that this will not affect our relationship, said Lin Li. He reckoned that the 5 high priests had already told Sendros about the matter in detail after seeing that they had shown up together. Hence, he didn't bother being polite. However, he was only upset with Zokila and the other high priests who had plotted against him. He still had a good impression of Sendros, and thus wasn't too harsh with his words. Master Felek, this was negligence on my part. I failed to give them clear instructions, and they're also feeling ashamed of their actions now. We hope to seek your forgiveness, Sendros said in a sincere tone. Sendros was the chief high priest of the Darkness Shrine, and he was definitely at the top of the hierarchy in Amril. Yet, he was swallowing his pride and apologizing to Lin Li, who felt rather embarrassed about that. If he were to harp on it and continue being upset, he would seem like a petty person. Hence, Lin Li sighed, and said, "Master Sendros, why do you bother?" Although Lin Li didn't directly say that he would stay, Sendros could tell from Lin Li's tone that he was less uptight. Hence, he turned his head to the 5 high priests beside him, and yelled, "What are you waiting for?" The 5 high priests did not hesitate any longer, and quickly stepped forward to bow to Lin Li. "Master Felix, we are at fault for this." Although they were high priests of the Darkness Shrine, they were extremely willing to apologize because they had already found out that Lin Li was the incarnation of the God of Darkness. Even if they were made to apologize to him despite having done no wrong, they still wouldn't find it to be inappropriate. "High priests, I do regard you guys as seniors and friends, but what have you taken me for? Since Master Sendros has come forward to apologize to me for this matter, I will let it slide, but if this happens again, I'll make the culprit pay the price." Lin Li was polite and cordial with Sendros, but he couldn't be bothered to be nice to the 5 high priests. No one would be pleased to get plotted against. Seeing that Lin Li had finally agreed to stay, Sendros waved his hands to chase them away, and he planned to continue to appease Lin Li. In fact, the 5 high priests had indeed given him some help too. At least he managed to verify Lin Li's identity through the characteristics of the Shadow Realm. "Master Sendros, when I met Belisi at the Brilliant Shrine previously, he mentioned that you invited me this time because of an important matter. After I arrived, you didn't mention it, and I didn't have the opportunity to ask either. However, can you tell me what it is now?" Lin Li asked before Sendros could even say anything. Although he had forgiven the 5 high priests, he still had to know the reason they had put him through everything. Lin Li had arranged the matter of going to the Darkness Shrine to be the last of his itinerary because he had no idea why Sendros was looking for him. If he had encountered the same issue that he had in the Sky Castle previously, and ended up wasting more than half a year, Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine would have probably been in danger. Moreover, the Darkness Shrine and Brilliant Shrine were rivals, after all, and had been at odds for countless years. No matter how the Darkness Shrine felt about Lin Li, they would definitely stop him if they were to find out that he was going to the Brilliant Shrine to give Pope Rosario the antidote. Actually, the only thing that the Darkness Shrine lacked compared to the Brilliant Shrine were powerhouses of the Sanctuary Realm, who were powerful and daunting. Hence, the Brilliant Shrine definitely wouldn't let go of a chance to make the Brilliant Shrine's Sanctuary Realm powerhouse fall. "Master Felix, when you came from the Brilliant Shrine, the Viper's poison in Rosario's body must have already been removed, right?" Sendros asked with excitement in his gaze even though he didn't have much of an expression. Although the fact that Rosario had been poisoned by Viper's poison had been kept under wraps, it was actually only a secret to the believers of the lower classes. The big shots like Sendros had already found out long ago. Besides, the Darkness Shrine couldn't take advantage of the matter anyway. After all, Rosario was still a powerhouse of the Sanctuary Realm, even though he had used a portion of his power and energy to suppress Viper's poison. Sendros didn't ask about the matter with the intention to blame Lin Li. After all, Lin Li was not a member of the Darkness Shrine, and the Darkness Shrine was in no position to interfere with what he did. However, Sendros was also a pharmaceutics master, and his passion for pharmaceutics was also the reason he could become friends with the Archbishop in Los of the Brilliant Shrine. Hence, Sendros knew that a pharmaceutics guru was necessary for the Viper's poison in Rosario's body to be removed. That was what he was interested in. Lin Li touched his nose embarrassedly because he had delayed his acceptance of Sendros' invitation and treated Rosario. Although there was nothing wrong with it, it was still somewhat embarrassing. Hence, Lin Li did not hide the matter from Sendros, and simply nodded. "Yes, you probably also know that when I was in the Haiga mountain range, I removed the poison of a descendant of the Viper in the bodies of several elves. I've also managed to find out about the characteristics of the Viper's poison. Although the Viper's poison in His Holiness Pope Rosario's body was much harder to deal with, there were fortunately no major changes in the poison over the decades. Hence, the process was rather smooth and successful." Upon hearing Lin Li admit that Rosario had recovered, Sendros did not have any special expression on his face, and instead he smilingly said, "Do you remember what I said to you back when we were in the Blackstone Mountains? Did you manage to get Rosario's sun scepter?" There is no sun scepter, but there is a Helios scepter." Although Lin Li was not the kind to let himself get taken advantage of, he had already gained plenty of benefits from the Brilliant Shrine. Not only had he clinched various business cooperation agreements, he had also learned holy light magic from Rosario. The sun scepter was not only a scepter, but also a sacred object of the Brilliant Shrine. It symbolized the supreme power and authority of the Pope, and regardless of how thick-skinned Lin Li might be, he'd never dare to ask Rosario for it. Besides, to Lin Li, the sun scepter was not extremely valuable, even though it contained a massive amount of pure holy light, which would be a great enhancement to theurgy. Not to forget, Lin Li still had the debris of the stars, holy light. In Amril, nothing could compare to that piece of the debris of the stars in terms of holy light. Of course, Sendros had no idea that Lin Li had a piece of the debris of the stars that was even more formidable than the sun scepter, for which reason Lin Li didn't want to ask Rosario for the sun scepter. Sendros shook his head in regret, and said, "You have brought yourself a ton of trouble." "A ton of trouble? What do you mean?" asked Lin Li, taken aback. He couldn't think of what kind of trouble he would cause himself by not asking for the sun scepter. In fact, he would be in actual trouble if he were to ask for it. "That's why I invited you here. As an incarnation of the god of darkness, there will definitely be a day when you fight Rosario. Without the Viper's poison, Rosario will definitely be able to return to the peak of his strength soon. Coupled with the sacred object of the Brilliant Shrine, the sun scepter, you're definitely in trouble. Don't you agree?" Sendros sounded a little sarcastic, and seemed to be gloating. "Wait, Master Sendros, what do you mean? Why don't I understand what you're talking about? Why would I fight Pope Rosario? Although I wish to be an incarnation of the god of darkness, I'm really not. I'm just an ordinary and insignificant mage," Lin Li quickly clarified. Although being an incarnation of the god of darkness and the son of the holy light would be giving himself huge support, he knew that it was all because of his debris of the stars, holy light and gloomy dark. Indeed, he would be able to become a significant figure of status and power in Amril as long as he relied on the Brilliant Shrine or the Darkness Shrine. The Dark Blade was a good example. They managed to rise and grow into the most powerful force in the breezy plains from a group of bandits. However, that was definitely all from the perspective of ordinary people. Lin Li did not hope for there to be any brand on himself and the Tower of Dusk. Lin Li didn't find there to be anything wrong with his status quo. The Tower of Dusk had already been developed, and even though it still could not be compared to the Brilliant Shrine and Darkness Shrine, he believed that he would definitely grow towards becoming as strong as the two major shrines sooner or later. This time, he went to the Brilliant Shrine to get rid of the Viper's poison in Rosario, which had tormented him for many years. He could definitely be considered the major benefactor of the Brilliant Shrine, and that fact alone was what allowed him to gain plenty of benefits from the Brilliant Shrine. If he were to assume the identity of being the incarnation of the god of darkness, his cordial relationship with the Brilliant Shrine would probably vanish. Ordinary and insignificant mage? Isn't that nonsense? Even a fool wouldn't believe his words. Sendros cussed in his head. Although Lin Li denied it very straightforwardly, he smiled nonchalantly, and said, "Master Felix, did you go to the Scar of Death back in the Blackstone Mountains?" "Yeah, but I didn't go to the Scar of Death alone. The Judge Paladin from the Brilliant Shrine went with me," said Lin Li, who continued to feign ignorance. Regardless of what Sendros said, Lin Li would definitely deny it. "However, of all people, you were the only one who entered the legendary realm within a short period of time. On top of that, you were also the only one who created the light and darkness domain. I'm correct, aren't I?" said Sendros, who didn't seem to be affected by Lin Li's attitude at all. He continued to expose all the evidence that he had. "Oh, you're referring to that." Lin Li pretended to have had a moment of epiphany, but soon changed his expression again. He continued in a regretful tone, "Don't you know about that too? When I entered the legendary realm, it was actually during the battle with the Lord of Darkness in the Abyss of Tharlan. When I created the light and darkness domain, I gained some enlightenment about the laws of darkness from the Lord of Darkness. Besides, if I'm really the incarnation of the God of Darkness, I should be creating a pure darkness domain, shouldn't I? Have you ever seen a dark mage using the power of light? That's also part of the basis for my judgment, Sendros said, looking as if he had already expected to hear it a long time ago. He looked at Lin Li smugly, and continued, if you only had insights into the generic and ordinary laws of darkness, you'd only be able to exert the all-devouring effects of the laws of darkness if you mastered the purest laws of darkness. Right, no wonder you misunderstood. It seems that I didn't make it clear at the time. I created the magical domain of frost, light, and darkness, not the light and darkness domain. The frost rule was also the intermediary that allowed the laws of light and darkness to be put together. It has nothing to do with any darkness incarnation. Lin Li squinted and leaned back against the chair nonchalantly, seemingly trying to say, "What can you do about me?" Sendros was rather patient, and he couldn't be bothered by Lin Li's attitude either. He continued, "What about now? Do you still need the frost laws as an intermediary for your light and darkness domain? Besides, do you know where Zokila brought you to just now? That's the shadow realm that only the high priests of the darkness domain can enter and leave freely. If one doesn't have a certain degree of enlightenment about the laws of darkness, it will be impossible to come out of that place." So what? Since I could create the light and darkness domain, I also naturally understand the laws of darkness. What's so strange about me being able to come out of there? Lin Li asked in disapproval. However, you not only came out, but also destroyed the laws of the Shadow Realm. Although it was only a small part of the Shadow Realm, it would still be impossible to break the laws in it without a deeper understanding of the laws of darkness. So, you are the darkness incarnation, said Sendros, who gave another theory and explanation. Besides, it was an absolutely irrefutable, concrete piece of evidence. Well, I managed to come out using another method. Anyway, the darkness incarnation that you're talking about has nothing to do with me. It's up to you to say what you want, but I'm just an ordinary mage. Lin Li immediately tried to refute, and regardless of what reasons or evidence Sendros had, Lin Li would insist that he wasn't the incarnation. Damn, this kid is really stubborn. However, I can't possibly lock him up and torture him until he admits it. Feeling a little helpless, Sendros waved his hand, and said, well, let's not talk about that for now. I invited you here this time, because I actually need your help for something. I hope you can agree. Oh? Please speak your mind. I'll agree as long as it's within my means, and doesn't require me to be the incarnation, said Lin Li. He didn't make any promises so as to leave a way out for himself. What's wrong with being the darkness incarnation? The darkness incarnation has an extremely high status in the darkness shrine, and even the darkness council will have to obey you. I remember you seemed to be happy to take on the role back in the Blackstone Mountains, Sendros said in anger. Back then, Lin Li had agreed rather readily. If it weren't for the fact that he had to verify it himself, things probably wouldn't have been that troublesome now. Oh, that, Lin Li said as he recalled how he had agreed without hesitation to become the darkness incarnation in order for Sendros to help him back then. Although he'd been joking, he couldn't help but blush in embarrassment at the thought of it. However, things were different now. He could help Sendros, but he didn't want to be a darkness incarnation. Hence, he said, at that time I was still young and frivolous. Now that I think about it, I was really insensible. How could I make such a casual remark about being the darkness incarnation when it's such a significant title? I'm really sorry, Master Sendros. Young and frivolous, Sendros was speechless, and had nothing to say to Lin Li, whose skin was thicker than that of the Wyrms. He had no other choice but to hand the darkness scripture to Lin Li while explaining, this is the supreme scripture of the darkness shrine which is accessible only to the chief high priest. Apart from the greatest magical mysteries of the darkness shrine, there are also some words left behind by the first high priest, Rog, written there. Take a look. This is the darkness scripture. I came to the darkness shrine by myself all for the sake of reading this. Lin Li thought to himself as he grabbed the thick scripture, and gently flipped the black ancient-looking cover. Of course, it was not the time to study it now. The first thing Lin Li read was the first High Priest Rog's words Sendros mentioned. During the late Dark Age, the first High Priest of the Darkness Shrine, Rog, was once the closest comrade of Juresco, the god of mages, and the most powerful mage in the world apart from Juresco at that time. It was said that Rog wasn't any less talented than Juresco in magic. If he had continued practicing magic, he probably wouldn't have been inferior to the mage in terms of attainments in magic. However, when the Tree of Eternity was overthrown by Juresco back then, Rog obtained the Darkness Doctrine, and embarked on a completely different path from Juresco. At the end of the Dark Age, there was a battle to overthrow the rule of the High Elves. The first of the most famous human powerhouses was Juresco, followed by Apophis, Midgard, and Rog. After 1,000 years, Juresco had already left Amrel, and was said to have gone to the chaos of time and space to search for something. Midgard and Apophis, the arbitrators of the Supreme Council, had been living well in Amrel for the past 1,000-odd years. However, at that time, Rog's abilities were far greater than those of Apophis and Midgard. Logically speaking, he should have a greater lifespan than the two of them. However, that was the strange part. About only 100 years after Rog became the first High Priest of the Darkness Shrine, news of his death surfaced. No one knew why he died, and there wasn't even a trace of his corpse. All that was left were the words he had written in the scripture. A powerhouse of the sanctuary realm was extremely important to a force, as evidenced by Rosario's significance to the brilliant shrine. With the fall of a sanctuary realm powerhouse like Rog, the Darkness Shrine almost collapsed overnight, and was no longer on par with the brilliant shrine. While recalling the story about Rog, Lin Li read Rog's message in the Darkness scripture, which was rather difficult to read. The message left behind by Rog was actually comprised of a variety of texts in different languages like the ancient Wyrm language, High Elven print, and ancient demon language. Most importantly, there seemed to be no normal order at all, for the texts were all arranged in a messy order which gave Lin Li a huge headache. Lin Li took a closer look, and finally had no choice but to raise his head to look at Sendros. Even though he had learned plenty of words from the Book of Eternity, he felt that it was rather difficult to understand the meaning of those texts. However, the Darkness scripture had existed in the Darkness Shrine for such a long time, and Lin Li reckoned that the Darkness Shrine had never stopped researching it. Hence, there was no point in abusing himself. When Sendros saw Lin Li looking at him, Sendros smirked wryly, and said, "Although we've been studying this text for more than 1,000 years since the fall of High Priest Rog, we still can't find any words that are linked. We've even tried to analyze each word and character." However, Sendros nonetheless grabbed the Darkness scripture and placed it on the table before extending his arm to point out some things, and explain the words to Lin Li. This sentence should be referring to the Tree of Eternity. This phrase is simpler, and it probably refers to the immortal king. This is something along the lines of one day, the owner of darkness, will take his throne, and this one's slightly more complicated. Through the path to the big crack, and then. After listening to Sendros' explanation, Lin Li shook his head, and said, "So, Master Sendros, what do you need my help for? We haven't made any progress in our research of the other texts, but we did make some discoveries recently about this big crack. We discovered that this big crack has something to do with both the fall of the first High Priest, Rog, and the catastrophe that struck the Darkness Shrine hundreds of years ago." At the mention of this, Sendros could not help but look worried. High Priest Rog was comparable to Juresco, and the rest of the Darkness Shrine was still inferior to him even before their fall. However, he still did not manage to stop things from happening. Are these two things related? Upon hearing his words, Lin Li couldn't help but muse to himself. How unlucky of the Darkness Shrine to experience a huge disaster right after their comeback. Although Pope Rosario had been tortured by viper's poison for decades, he actually managed to wait until Lin Li, a pharmaceutics guru, appeared. On top of that, Prophet Willan and Rodhart of the Brilliant Shrine had also suffered huge blows. That was extremely unlucky. Sendros naturally didn't know what Lin Li was musing about. After hearing Lin Li's question, he continued, well, lately, we feel that there have been some strange issues with the magical waves of the Night Canyon. After some investigation, we found out that the abnormalities stem from the Eternal Darkness Altar, which is the first place of worship for the God of Darkness. However, High Priest Rog made it a forbidden place at one point. Only members of the Darkness Council would be granted access. We headed to the Eternal Darkness Altar to look for the reasons for the abnormalities, but we ended up finding a scepter that had been discarded for many years. Did it belong to High Priest Rog? Lin Li asked carefully, worried that Sendros would mention the Darkness Incarnation again. However, when he heard those words, he began to get curious. Since the Eternal Darkness Altar was the forbidden area of the Darkness Shrine, not everyone could enter, and it seemed that High Priest Rog was the most likely to be the person who'd left the scepter there. However, Sendros shook his head, and simply refuted Lin Li's guess. He explained, it was a scepter from the Brilliant Shrine which only archbishops are qualified to use. Does the disappearance of High Priest Rog actually have something to do with the Brilliant Shrine? Actually, it seems that it is indeed possible since you guys and the Brilliant Shrine are rivals. The people of the Brilliant Shrine reached your forbidden ground, and even made your High Priest go missing. It's no wonder that no one knows about this, Lin Li said in shock. At first, we did think that this might have been a conspiracy of the Brilliant Shrine, but later on, we found out through the negotiations with the Brilliant Shrine that the owner of this scepter was Prophet Willin, who disappeared hundreds of years ago. Prophet Willin was known as the Son of the Holy Light, and was also a legendary figure of Amrel. Even Sendros was extremely emotional at the mention of him. So it was Willin's scepter. Lin Li looked at Sendros, but didn't interject. Willin and Rodhart had once gone to the Darkness Shrine together, and it was recorded in the records of the Brilliant Shrine. However, the purpose of their visit was not mentioned. He wondered if there would be any relevant records in the Darkness Shrine. There are records of Prophet Willin's visit to the Darkness Shrine. Besides, he wasn't alone, and he actually came with his brother Rodhart, who used to be the referee of heresy. According to the information, the two of them had indeed gone deep into the Eternal Darkness Altar when they arrived at the Night Canyon. However, we have no idea what they did there and why the scepter was there. The important figures of the Brilliant Shrine had entered the forbidden area of the Darkness Shrine, but Sendros didn't say anything about it. Isn't the Eternal Darkness Altar the forbidden place of the Darkness Shrine? You guys actually allowed them to enter freely? Lin Li asked, not trying to make fun of them or anything. However, it was the Darkness Shrine, after all, although they did not have a powerhouse like Rog, they had already recovered most of their power after hundreds of years of recovery. Hence, they were strong enough to fight the Brilliant Shrine. How could they easily allow the people of the Brilliant Shrine to enter their forbidden grounds? Although the Eternal Darkness Altar is a forbidden area of the Darkness Shrine, it was said that they had the token of the first High Priest Rog at that time. Those who owned the token would be granted access to everything in the Darkness Shrine as long as they did not utter blasphemies towards the God of Darkness, Sendros explained patiently. Everything was making sense again after being put together. Willin and Rodhart actually had the token of High Priest Rog. It was no wonder that they were allowed to enter the forbidden Eternal Darkness Altar. Lin Li's eyes suddenly lit up, and he quickly asked Sendros, since the Darkness Shrine allowed them to enter, would there be a more detailed record of their entry into the Eternal Darkness Altar? One reason Lin Li came to the Darkness Shrine was Sendros' invitation, and another was his desire to read the Darkness Scripture. However, there was also another very important purpose of his visit, and that was to get a clear idea of what had happened to Willin and Rodhart, especially how Rodhart became a Retribution Knight. However, after hearing Lin Li's question, Sendros shook his head, and said, according to a high priest who led them to the Eternal Darkness Altar, they got into a dispute after going deep into the Eternal Darkness Altar, but no one knows what it was about. We only know that Rodhart disappeared suddenly after the dispute. No one knows where he went, and he only appeared again 10 days later. Were there any changes to him after he appeared? Lin Li asked as he vaguely felt that the matter of Rodhart disappearing for 10 days had something to do with him becoming a Retribution Knight later on. No one knows that. After Rodhart appeared, the two of them left the Eternal Darkness altar, but shortly after that, a disaster fell upon the Darkness Shrine. Only a few survived, and many things that happened then were thus erased from history, Sendros said regretfully. If it weren't because of the disaster, there would at least have been some useful information. Could that disaster of the Darkness Shrine have been caused by the two of them? It sounds like they killed the witnesses to stop them from spreading news. What happened during the disaster? Given the Darkness Shrine's power, it shouldn't have ended up in such a terrible state even if the Brilliant Shrine and the Supreme Council had colluded with each other, said Lin Li, who was rather interested in the disaster that had caused the Darkness Shrine to decline. Sendros had no choice but to smile wryly at hearing Lin Li's analysis. He said, "We don't know the details of the actual event, but Rodhart became a Retribution Knight later, and manipulated Death Knights to cause a stir in the breezy plains. I don't know if it has anything to do with the Eternal Darkness altar, but Willan was the one who purified him in the end. As for the disaster of the Darkness Shrine, oh, if it has nothing to do with the matter this time, let's forget about it," said Lin Li, who noticed that Sendros seemed a little hesitant to speak. Although he knew that it might be a very important secret of the Darkness Shrine, he still felt a little unhappy. He thought, the problem is, why did you invite me here? You claimed that you needed my help for something important, and yet you stopped at the critical juncture. We do have some ties with each other, but you can't make me die for you without letting me know anything. Sendros was also a little embarrassed after hearing Lin Li's words. Although Lin Li refused to admit it, he had already identified Lin Li to be the Darkness incarnation. Hence, there was no need to keep it a secret from Lin Li. At the thought of this, Sendros said that disaster is considered a secret because if word about it spreads, it will likely cause panic among the believers of darkness. That reason was the same as that of the Brilliant Shrine for keeping the news of Rosario's poisoning under wraps. However, the incident had happened hundreds of years ago, so why would they panic now? Lin Li said, "Master Sendros, don't worry, I don't like telling stories to those who are uninvolved. The disaster that happened back then was not caused by any force in Amril. It actually stemmed from the beasts from the ancient times. They appeared in the Night Canyon, and the Darkness Shrine was the first to bear their attacks. We were almost completely razed to the ground. The Darkness Shrine was outnumbered and outclassed, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was a disaster that wiped out almost the entire Darkness Shrine." What? The ancient beasts? Lin Li panicked, and frantically asked, was it the prehistoric magical beasts? Yes, Sendros answered with a nod. Although he looked calm on the surface, there was a tinge of anxiety in his eyes. He continued, to be precise, it was a group of minotaurs which held giant axes and rode three-headed lion scorpions. Every one of them had at least legendary power. Under the attacks of the group of minotaurs, the past Darkness Shrine was destroyed before they could even resist. Damn it, so it was a herd of minotaurs. Those were well-known and powerful amongst the prehistoric magical beasts. Besides, they also rode lion scorpions, and formed a powerful army comprised of legendary individuals. It would probably be a piece of cake for them to wipe out the entire Amril. Even if the Brilliant Shrine was involved, they wouldn't be able to survive the attacks by the minotaurs. Although Lin Li had never fought against the real prehistoric magical beasts before, he had still seen the battle between Juresco and the Evil-Eye Tyrant through the beacon of time and space in Tutankhamun's hut. He had witnessed how terrifying the prehistoric magical beasts were, and it'd definitely be the end of the entire continent when those horrendous creatures scurried to Amril. At the thought of this, Lin Li suddenly remembered what he had heard about the Black Current, the magic tides, and the cracks in spacetime in Tutankhamun's hut. It was said that at the end of the Dark Age, there were 3 black currents that sparked the development of the magical civilization in Amril. Lin Li managed to see the first during the battle between Juresco and the Evil-Eye Tyrant using the spacetime beacon spell. Of course, there were also 4 other prehistoric magical beasts, like Chimera. According to Stephen of the Dark Blade, the second time was the one which gave the Darkness Shrine a huge blow. However, there were still some discrepancies on both sides compared to Sendros' news. The third time was the time when Rosario got poisoned, and it was also said to have been the most intense one in history. The Brilliant Shrine worked with the Darkness Shrine to kill off all of the descendants of the prehistoric magical beasts before the Black Current struck. They only managed to contain the terrible disaster by doing that. In the past, Stephen from the Dark Blade mentioned that thousands of powerful magical beasts poured out of a crack in spacetime and attacked the Darkness Shrine. The Darkness Shrine was stained with blood overnight, and numerous elites died after being attacked by the magical beasts. The battle lasted 7 days and 7 nights, and the Darkness Shrine eventually killed all of the magical beasts, but they also paid a terrible price. According to Sendro's account, the Darkness Shrine failed to persevere and push through during the attacks of the Minotaurs, let alone kill them. Of course, in comparison, Sendro's words were definitely more reliable. After all, Stephen might have had a high and authoritative status in the Dark Blade, but he was nothing in the Darkness Shrine. How could he know more about the truth than the chief high priest Sendros? However, after comparing both their statements, the question in Lin Li's mind surfaced again. Since the Darkness Shrine did not stop the Minotaurs at all, why didn't the latter launch an attack on the entire Anril after the destruction of the Darkness Shrine? In that case, who was the one who destroyed the Minotaurs? Lin Li asked to raise his doubts. Even if the Minotaurs had been eventually wiped out, their appearance would have definitely still been recorded in history. Since there were no records, that meant that the matter only affected the Darkness Shrine. What were the insider details, then? Destroy? No. Sendros shook his head gently. He continued, after they destroyed the Darkness Shrine, they seemed to have gotten suppressed by some kind of force, and were not able to break out of the Night Canyon. Instead, they returned to the crack in spacetime. That crack is located just below the Eternal Darkness altar, and has been suppressed by the first High Priest Rog with a seal. Hence, we suspect that this crack and those prehistoric magical beasts have something to do with High Priest Rog's disappearance. There's a spacetime rift under the Eternal Darkness altar? Lin Li asked in shock as he thought about the High Priest Rog, Willen, and Rodhart. He reckoned that they had probably found some things in there, and that High Priest Rog's disappearance, Willen's disappearance, and Rodhart's becoming a Retribution Knight probably were more than a coincidence. However, it was not bad news for Lin Li. If the Eternal Darkness altar had nothing to it, he wouldn't want to see it. After all, there was too little information about Willen and Rodhart. If there was no useful information even in the Eternal Darkness altar, the leads that Lin Li had could be considered broken off, and he might not be able to find any other clues. Lin Li wasn't too interested in Prophet Willen, but Rodhart was linked to the 2 pieces of the debris of the stars in the underground palace, Raging Flames and Polar Snow. Lin Li couldn't guarantee that the fierce deity who was once famous in Anril could continue to hibernate when he really acquired Polar Snow and Raging Flames. The Retribution Knight had conducted a massacre in Anril and had terrifying abilities. If Lin Li was clueless about that, his outcome would probably be unfavorable. Although the spacetime rift seemed to be rather dangerous, Lin Li still decided to find a chance to find out about it. Otherwise, he wouldn't feel confident about dealing with Rodhart, whose powers were at least of the sanctuary level. However, Lin Li did not immediately mention that idea to Sendros, and simply said calmly, "Master Sendros, speaking of which, you haven't told me why you got me to come here." Actually, he could already guess what Sendros needed help with, and he reckoned that it probably had something to do with the Eternal Darkness altar. Hence, there was no need for him to take the initiative to mention it. Sendros naturally didn't know what Lin Li was thinking. However, after he heard Lin Li's question again, there were finally some changes on his face. Seemingly deep in thought, he said, "Because the time is up." "What? What do you mean the time is up?" Lin Li asked in puzzlement, for he had no idea what that had to do with him. About 600 years have passed between the time that High Priest Rog sealed the Eternal Darkness altar and the time of Willen's and Rodhart's arrival. Another 600 years have passed since their visit. Lately, I've been feeling a little uneasy, and after I thought about the abnormal mana waves in the Night Canyon, I sensed that the disaster seems to be on the verge of striking the Darkness Shrine again, Sendros said with worry written all over his face. Wait, this time, shouldn't it be? Lin Li thought about it, and felt that the timing seemed to be somewhat different from what Tutankhamun mentioned. Didn't Tutankhamun said that the black current would appear once every 400 years, together with the magic tides? He thought. He decided to tell Sendros about Tutankhamun's conjecture and the things that Stephen said. Actually, Tutankhamun is not wrong, but what Stephen said was just a speculation made by the Darkness Shrine a long time ago. The magic tides and the black current indeed happen once about every 400 years, but High Priest Rog's seal gave the Darkness Shrine 200 more years to struggle. Unfortunately, the Darkness Shrine did not notice the good intentions of High Priest Rog during the previous catastrophe. Hence, we wasted the 200 years that were meant for making preparations, said Sendros, who wasn't shocked to hear what Lin Li said. So that's what happened, but what does this have to do with me? Lin Li asked. He didn't think that he'd be able to get rid of a disaster that would threaten even a powerhouse of the sanctuary realm with his current abilities. I don't know, but the prophecy says that only the Darkness Incarnation can save the Darkness Shrine, Sendros said while staring at Lin Li with an intense gaze that was full of anticipation. Back to that topic again. Lin Li rolled his eyes, but he couldn't be bothered to explain either. Anyway, he would never admit that he was the Darkness Incarnation. Seeing that Lin Li was vehemently refusing to acknowledge his identity, Sendros could not help but shake his head, and put the matter aside for a while. He then said, since you refuse to admit it, we shall drop the topic, Master Felix. However, in the past few days, there had been some delay because I had to check on some things in the Eternal Darkness Altar. I hope you'll stay in the Darkness Shrine for a few more days this time. We can talk about the cooperation, and if you're interested in dark magic, I can lend the Darkness Scripture to you temporarily. Well, Lin Li obviously wished for such a wonderful offer. After pretending to be restraining himself for a while, he nodded and agreed. All right. As long as you don't say anything about the Darkness Incarnation again, I'll stay and impose on you for a few more days. Although Lin Li still did not acknowledge the identity of the Darkness Incarnation, Sendros was rather delighted to hear that Lin Li had agreed to stay in the Darkness Shrine as a guest. He thought, it doesn't matter if the kid doesn't want to admit that he is the Darkness Incarnation now. If the catastrophe really strikes the Darkness Shrine, no one can be alone, and he will then have to admit it. Lin Li stayed behind as a guest in the Darkness Shrine, and Sendros really did not mention the Darkness Incarnation again. The 5 high priests were also informed about it, and did not mention the Darkness Incarnation even though they seemed to look at Lin Li with some piety. You want to talk about the cooperation, huh? Since you refuse to admit that you are the Darkness Incarnation, we'll have to talk about whatever there is to talk about. Sendros thought to himself. Since he could lead the Darkness Shrine to its current developed state, Sendros was definitely far more capable than just being a good mage. When talking about the cooperation with Lin Li, Sendros exhibited the brilliance of an excellent leader. He wasn't calculative, but was rather serious about all details. He didn't let the Tower of Dusk take advantage of them, and he also fought for what the Darkness Shrine deserved. Lin Li was feeling extremely helpless as well. He felt that Sendros was being too petty for his age, for Lin Li merely refused to be the Darkness Incarnation. However, that was a good thing too. Although he didn't manage to take more advantage in the cooperation itself was supposed to offer mutual benefits in the first place, and Sendros wasn't stingy with the benefits that the Tower of Dusk would be getting. The most important point of cooperation between the Tower of Dusk and the Darkness Shrine could be considered an exchange for talent using materials. The development of the Tower of Dusk had been rather rapid and stellar, but at the end of the day, it had only been established for more than 2 years, and it still seemed to lack some talents. The definition of talent was not just being good at magic. A force would require a variety of talents to develop, and it would obviously be too slow to cultivate some talents from scratch. Compared to the forces in the breezy plains, the problem of the lack of talent wasn't that serious, but Lin Li was not satisfied with letting the Tower of Dusk dominate only the breezy plains. His goal was to let the Tower of Dusk become the strongest force in the entire Anril, just like the Brilliant Shrine and the Supreme Council. In fact, with the development momentum of the Tower of Dusk, it wasn't impossible to achieve that goal, but with the expansion of the Tower of Dusk's businesses, the lack of talent had gradually become the key in restricting the development of the Tower of Dusk. Although the Darkness Shrine had experienced a destructive disaster, they still had a heritage more than a millennium and a strong foundation, especially in terms of accumulation of talent. Hence, the Tower of Dusk was far from comparable to them. The problem the Darkness Shrine had was as simple as poverty. However, that did not mean that they only lacked money. They also lacked various materials, magical equipment, and potions. Of course, it could also be chalked up to them being too poor to afford those things. Although the wealth possessed by the Darkness Shrine was beyond the reach of many forces, it still wasn't enough for them to rise again and return to their heyday. Hence, the Tower of Dusk and the Darkness Shrine clinched a deal where materials would be exchanged for talents. Of course, it didn't mean that the Darkness Shrine would transfer all of their talents to the Tower of Dusk. Those who would be joining the Tower of Dusk were similar to mercenaries. After all, the Tower of Dusk was the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, and not only did they lack talents, their talents were also individualistic. Although they had conquered a group of small and medium-sized forces, those people were definitely not talents, and were merely in charge of hard labor. However, it was different for the Darkness Shrine. There were believers of darkness of various occupations such as assassins, warriors, bandits, and so on, all of whom were far stronger than the small and medium-sized forces under the Tower of Dusk. After several days of negotiation and reaching a consensus, the first batch consisting of members of all professions above level 15 immediately set off to the Tower of Dusk with their contracts under the lead of the legendary priest Belisi. Lin Li selected those people not simply based on their strength and power, but also because of their talents in other aspects, such as business management, forging, potion making, etc. Once those people reached the Tower of Dusk, they would not only increase the combat power of the Tower of Dusk by a significant amount, they would also play a significant role in other aspects. After all, combat was just a small portion of a faction's strength. After sending away those believers of darkness, Lin Li also began to focus on his own matters. Sendros fulfilled his promise, and lent the darkness scripture to Lin Li. Although the scripture was considered a supreme treasure to the Darkness Shrine, Sendros had long recognized Lin Li to be the darkness incarnation, and he wished Lin Li would make a sudden breakthrough in dark magic. Reading the darkness scripture was necessary, and the 5 legendary level high priests had all become Lin Li's best companions. It was a rare opportunity as the 5 high priests were all legendary powerhouses who were between level 22 and level 23. Whenever they talked, Lin Li would learn something new. Lin Li would put theory into practice, and he seemed to learn something new about dark force and make progress in mastering it every single day. Although Lin Li did not take out the debris of the star's gloomy dark in order to avoid hearing Sendros mention the darkness incarnation again, he was still certain that he definitely had better control of it now. After studying in the Brilliant Shrine, Lin Li gained a better understanding and control over the nomological power of Holy Light, but the power of the light and darkness domain that he created did not improve much, because the other important component of laws of the light and darkness domain, the darkness domain, had become a shortcoming of the magical domain. Now that he was reading the darkness scripture with the personal guidance of Sendros and the company of the 5 high priests who helped him train, Lin Li gradually made up for this shortcoming, and the power of the light and darkness domain began to increase rapidly. Of course, during this period of time, Lin Li was not the only one who had really benefited. Sendros was still feeling worried about the disaster that would strike the Darkness Shrine this time, but after confirming that Lin Li was the darkness incarnation, he was somewhat relieved. Sendros, who was an avid fan of pharmaceutics, obviously wouldn't miss the opportunity to consult a real pharmaceutics guru about pharmaceutics now that he had gotten some peace of mind at last. Although the 5 high priests were not very interested in pharmaceutics, they still gained something from every sparring session with Lin Li. As for actual combat experience, Lin Li was no worse than the high priests who had lived for hundreds of years, and was in fact even better than them, even though he was only in his early 20s. Although Lin Li didn't have much experience, he had absorbed some of the information obtained from the controlling magical crystal in the Sky Castle, and also gotten some experience accumulated over 10,000 years in Balak's magical crystal. Hence, he only lacked the fusion of those experiences. It could be said that during each discussion and sparring session, Lin Li would digest and absorb part of those experiences and knowledge, and transform them into his own. During each of those sessions, the 5 high priests would act like they had received a treasure whenever Lin Li revealed a little bit of what he had learned. The 5 of them had initially treated him with added respect only because of his identity as the darkness incarnation, but after the interactions they had during this period, they began to look up to him and feel convinced with his abilities in every aspect. During Lin Li's stint at the Darkness Shrine, he continuously improved his strength and abilities in terms of experience, knowledge, and understanding of power. On the other hand, the Tower of Dusk was also developing and growing rapidly. The cooperation with the Brilliant Shrine had enabled the Tower of Dusk to truly step out of the Felon Kingdom and gain unobstructed access to everywhere in the world where there were believers of holy light. Their business activities and operations were almost unimpeded. Even the Glitter Gold Trade Union did not enjoy such advantageous treatment. At the same time, the secret cooperation between the Tower of Dusk and King Sinelli of the Leaden Kingdom also proceeded smoothly. Under the instructions that were secretly given out by King Sinelli, many of the nobles of the Leaden Kingdom who owned mines and ores signed an agreement with the Tower of Dusk, thus providing a solution to the problem of lack of ores that the Tower of Dusk had been facing for a long time. In fact, the Tower of Dusk had been involved in the forging business for a long time, but the limited production scale had prevented their business from growing. If they were to go for the high-end market, Lin Li would have to do it himself. It would be fine for him to do so occasionally, but it wouldn't be sustainable in the long run, for Lin Li couldn't spend that much time on forging. Lin Li could impart his forging skills to the blacksmiths there, but most of the mineral resources in the Felon Kingdom were in the hands of the Marathon family, and even if they had better blacksmiths, they still couldn't produce more weapons without ore. Although the hatred and feud between Lin Li and the Marathon family were somewhat resolved by the intervention of the Supreme Council, they still weren't eliminated completely. It would be fine if Matthias was just a wastrel and a letdown of the family, but throughout the hundreds of years that the Marathon family had existed, they had only produced one ingenious mage, and that was Matthias. Wilhelm had put a lot of effort into nurturing and grooming Matthias in hopes of making him a legendary mage who would help their family progress further. However, everything went down the drain because of Lin Li. Hence, they definitely still bore a strong grudge against the Tower of Dusk. Although the Marathon family dared not openly oppose the Supreme Council, they still had some control over the things within their industry. For example, suppressing the forging business of the Tower of Dusk and restricting them from obtaining a source of ore could be considered commercial competition, and the Supreme Council would not be able to intervene. In fact, shortly after the establishment of the Tower of Dusk, the Marathon family tried to monopolize the forging industry of the Breezy Plains through cooperation with the Dwarf Kingdom under the pretext of expanding the family business. Whether or not they had targeted the Tower of Dusk was subjective. After all, to outsiders at that time, the forging business was a very important source of income for the Tower of Dusk. At that time, the Marathon family did everything they could to recruit all the blacksmiths in the Breezy Plains in addition to using the dwarf blacksmiths, causing the Tower of Dusk smithy to have almost no room for development. Although it was said that the fate of a smithy lay in the hands of the top blacksmith, Lin Li, a smithing guru, would obviously have to do more than just forge magical weapons and magical equipment all day long. Excellent magical equipment could indeed enhance the reputation of the smithy, but running a business and maintaining the operations of the smithy was still reliant on the commerce of the middle and low-end weapons and equipment. After all, not everyone could afford the best magical equipment, and no fool would buy it unless the prices for the top-grade magical equipment were lowered to that of the low-end ones. The Tower of Dusk lacked blacksmiths and mining sites. Although they could still keep the forge running, and managed to become famous in the Breezy Plains with their ability to produce a piece of top-grade magical equipment every 10 to 14 days, that did not bring enough money for the Tower of Dusk. Fortunately, the Tower of Dusk began to dabble in the pharmaceutical business later on, and managed to rely on the pharmaceutical business to bring in a massive amount of money that solved their cash flow problems to support the operation of the Tower of Dusk. Although the Marathon family also owned a pharmaceutical business, they had less control over the pharmaceutical industry compared to the forging industry. Their original plan fell through, but they continued to suppress the forging business of the Tower of Dusk as much as possible. In terms of the control of the smithing talents, the Marathon family was much more lax. After all, there was not enough ore, and without sufficient ores, there was no use for there to be so many blacksmiths. However, there had been a large amount of high-quality ore being transported continuously from the Leaden Kingdom to the Tower of Dusk's forge in Duland lately. The biggest problem that hindered the Tower of Dusk's smithy from developing was finally solved. Before the Marathon family received the news, the smithy of the Tower of Dusk had recruited a large number of blacksmiths according to Lin Li's instructions, adding on to the senior blacksmiths who were originally working for them. Within less than 20 days, the blacksmith shop of the Tower of Dusk expanded more than tenfold. By the time the Marathon family realized what was going on, the high-quality ore from the Leaden Kingdom had already been forged into fine weapons and equipment by the blacksmiths, and begun impacting the weaponry market of the Felon Kingdom. That provided stiff competition for the Marathon family, and the Tower of Dusk even relentlessly snatched away a portion of the market. Actually, the Marathon family was not too worried at this juncture. In the forging industry which they had control over, there were still competitors, but in many cases, the competitors might not be able to occupy a significant position in the market if the quality of the equipment they offered wasn't up to standard. After all, it was not just about commercial activities. Having run a forging business for so many years, the Marathon family's connections and network of relations definitely couldn't be taken away easily, especially their ties with the military, which could not be easily meddled with by anyone. Even if the Tower of Dusk had a great reputation in the pharmaceutical industry, they couldn't really affect the military. The military would not prepare advanced potions for every soldier, but they would definitely equip all soldiers with weapons. After hundreds of years of operating a forging business, the Marathon family had already become the largest armament supplier in the Felon Kingdom, and had monopolized all the weapon supplies of the military. Relying on their cooperation with the military, the Marathon family controlled more than 70% of the forging industry in the Felon Kingdom. Everything that was related to forging would mostly be marked with the brand of the Marathon family forging workshop. During the hundreds of years of operation, the Marathon family had gained more than just business development. With the shockingly massive amount of wealth that they had, the Marathon family gradually penetrated the forces in every corner of the Felon Kingdom. From chapels to the military, there seemed to be people from the Marathon family everywhere, and they were all linked to each other by interests, forming a large network of human relations. Those who were outside the network would have a hard time getting in. However, the Marathon family had never thought that Lin Li would clinch a deal with Prince Arthur, who represented the royal family of the Felon Kingdom, back when he was in Alana. Although it was a pharmaceutical business deal, the royal family undoubtedly had a great influence on the military. The attitudes of the Brilliant Shrine and the Leaden Kingdom towards the Tower of Dusk were obvious evidence of their respect for the Tower of Dusk, and anyone could tell that they were keen on forging ties with the Tower of Dusk. In that case, how could the royal family cooperate with others now that they wished to get closer and cooperate more with the Tower of Dusk? Regardless of how many connections the Marathon family had, they still had to obey the royal family, which controlled the Felon Kingdom. There were only a few who would dare to rebel against the royal family, and by the time the Marathon family reacted, it would all be too late. Apart from the constant updates from the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li would also occasionally receive letters from Angelano when he was in the Darkness Shrine. Angelano, the alchemist, was very attentive when working in the Tower of Dusk for the sake of obtaining Balak's magical crystal that Lin Li had promised to give him. After Lin Li left, the first thing Angelano did was to restore the alchemy colossus that the Tower of Dusk had brought back from the Dragon Mountains. In the letter, Angelano complained to Lin Li more than once about the poor quality of the 4 alchemy colossuses that were peak-level alchemical masterpieces of this era, and were simply a huge insult to alchemy in his opinion. If it had not been necessary for him to stay in the Tower of Dusk, Angelano would have long run to the Rotterdam Kingdom to teach the so-called alchemists a hard lesson. Lin Li also had plenty of thoughts and emotions about that matter. When he first came into contact with the pharmacists of this world, and saw them being complacent yet making mistakes, he felt pretty much the same as Angelano did at the moment. However, the situation wasn't exactly terrible. After all, if there were pharmaceutics gurus everywhere, who would be impressed by Lin Li and be convinced with his abilities? If there were alchemical gurus everywhere, Angelano, too, would be nothing. In fact, the functions of the 4 alchemy colossuses were actually quite remarkable for this era. Even in the eyes of many people, it was considered an amazing feat for such a large figure to be able to move and fight. However, as a goblin, Angelano had the most complete and orthodox inherited alchemical knowledge in his mind. Seeing the alchemy created by his species getting ruined to such an extent, the anger within him was unimaginable. Each of the 4 alchemy colossuses was close to legendary level, and they played a huge role in protecting the Tower of Dusk during the previous attack of the Dark Blade. At the same time, each of them was damaged to varying extent during that battle, and although they were not completely destroyed, they had been incapacitated, and had lost their ability to fight. According to Angelano, there was no need to repair them at all, and he would just put them back into the furnace like they were scrap iron. Repairing the toy-like alchemy colossuses was like an insult to him, a guru-level alchemist. However, rebuilding an alchemy colossus required more than just excellent technique, and even the guru-level alchemist Angelano could not build a brand new alchemy colossus quickly with the full support of the Tower of Dusk. Hence, Angelano could only complain to Lin Li in the letter, then suck it up, and begin modifying the 4 pieces of scrap iron. Actually, apart from the temptation of Balak's magical crystal, Angelano did find his stay in the Tower of Dusk rather enjoyable. With the understanding of this era, Angelano gradually realized that the strength of the Tower of Dusk was almost unparalleled in Amril. No one refuted his requests during his study and research in alchemy, and he was given all the materials he needed as well. That was a kind of support that not all forces could give. In the past, Angelano still had the intention of leaving right after he got Balak's magical crystal, but after understanding the Tower of Dusk and Amril, his desire to leave gradually became weaker. Moreover, Angelano had been a follower of Osric for many years, and so had good judgment. He could tell from the rate of development of the Tower of Dusk that it was definitely worth investing in. After following Osric back then, he had been living well during the Dark Age, and if he wanted to continue doing so, staying in the Tower of Dusk would definitely be a good choice. With such intentions in mind, Angelano was naturally more serious about modifying the 4 alchemy colossuses. They were initially close to legendary level, and were allegedly able to contend with legendary powerhouses. However, the battle with the Dark Blade was evidence of them being far from reaching legendary level. The giant alchemy colossuses ought to have legendary level power, but the alchemists of Rotterdam did not have that kind of technology. Meanwhile, Angelano was a guru-level alchemist who truly had orthodox knowledge in alchemy, hence, it wasn't that difficult for him to unleash the potential of the alchemy colossuses. With Angelano working hard at the expense of the Tower of Dusk's financial resources, the 4 alchemy colossuses in the Tower of Dusk finally transformed drastically and reached the peak of their potential. After completing the transformation and modifications of the 4 alchemy colossuses, Angelano also studied the shadow assassins that Lin Li had left behind in the Tower of Dusk, as well as the 6 alchemy puppets that were made in the Eternal Furnace, which were then sent to Lin Li together with some supplies by the Tower of Dusk's caravan. The alchemy puppets were said to be no weaker than the shadow assassins. However, Lin Li did not immediately take them out to experiment, and simply studied them for a while, before putting them in the Ring of Endless Storm. He was rather confident in Angelano's alchemical skills, and since Angelano said that the puppets were better than the shadow assassins, it should really be the case. Kanoris, who had obtained a new body, had been working hard to integrate himself into the perfect body, and thus didn't send much information to Lin Li lately. Lin Li only found out through Angelano's letter that Kanoris had transformed some Death Knights using the Eternal Furnace and increased the number of Holy Death Knights to 24. Kanoris had allegedly developed an interest in Ujfalusi's humorous Wyrm as well, and asked Ujfalusi to let him experiment with it. However, Ujfalusi rejected his request. If the humorous WYRM were to become a holy WYRM, how could he, a lich, still dare to write it? However, Kanora's idea actually made Lin Li feel a little tempted. After all, he was not a lich, and he didn't have to worry about the issue of divine power. If he were to turn the Crimson Dragon in the summoning lamp into a holy WYRM. Of course, that was not what Lin Li ought to be thinking about now. Be it an alchemy colossus or a holy WYRM, he still could not really rely on them, and the only thing he could depend on was his own strength. Lin Li was thrilled for a while after receiving the letter, but soon put those thoughts away, and focused his attention on improving his own strength. Reading the darkness scripture, asking questions, and consulting Sendros, and sparring with the 5 high priests made his days feel rather pleasant. However, on this day, after finishing a day of studying, Lin Li induced some of his mental strength into the magical crystal of the Dragon of Destruction as he usually would, only to feel a sudden and massive magical wave that erupted from the depths of the night canyon. As soon as he exited, there was also a violent tremor in the entire darkness shrine, and a huge roar immediately filled the night canyon. Lin Li immediately put away the Dragon of Destruction's dragon crystal, and scurried towards the square outside the darkness shrine. At this time, Sendros and the 5 high priests had already arrived, with even more priests and believers of darkness behind them. However, they all looked extremely worried, and were staring at the endless darkness. Upon sight of Lin Li, Sendros' eyes glistened, but he didn't say much to Lin Li. Instead, he suddenly flew towards the source of darkness in the night canyon where the magical wave was coming from. The 5 high priests and some legendary level priests, too, followed Sendros closely without hesitation. At the thought of the things that Sendros had mentioned before, Lin Li was also plagued with worry at this time. Hence, he did not hesitate, and immediately used his power of flight to catch up with Sendros. Lin Li of course didn't think that he would really be the savior of the darkness shrine, but if it were within his means, he wouldn't mind putting in a little effort to help. After all, the darkness shrine was a partner in cooperation of the Tower of Dusk. The group flew throughout the entire journey, and they soon arrived at the source of the abnormality, which was the forbidden area of the darkness shrine, the eternal darkness altar. It was rather large, and resembled a carved hill surrounded by immense darkness aura. However, at the same time, the immense darkness aura was also continuously surging vigorously like an ocean during a storm. Despite having been at the darkness shrine for a long time, it was Lin Li's first time seeing the eternal darkness altar. After all, he didn't want Sendros to mention anything about the darkness incarnation again. He looked into the distance to see that the eternal darkness altar was just like a huge pyramid without a spire. There was above it a wide and spacious platform which seemed to have a larger surface area than the square outside the eternal darkness altar. On the platform of the altar, a large and complex magic array was running at full power. The immense darkness aura around it and the vigorous magical wave seemed to be coming from the array. Lin Li thought, this should be the seal laid out by High Priest Rog. He actually used the entire eternal darkness altar to conduct the sealing. I wonder how powerful and massive the thing being sealed is. Lin Li knew that given the power of the seal, sealing just a tiny space-time rift wouldn't actually be too difficult. However, based on the past disasters of the Darkness Shrine and the current situation, the thing in the space-time rift was probably the actual goal of the Darkness Shrine. The vibrations in the canyon did not cease, and there were rocks falling from the surrounding cliffs which seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The massive eternal darkness altar was also shaking because of the tremors, or rather, the eternal darkness altar was the one causing the tremors because of its violent shaking. It seemed that there was something trying to lift the eternal darkness altar and overturn it from below. Seeing that there were no prehistoric magical beasts in the surroundings of the eternal darkness altar, everyone in the darkness shrine couldn't help but feel a great sense of relief. After all, even in its heyday, the darkness shrine still wasn't able to resist the attacks of the prehistoric magical beasts. Hence, they definitely wouldn't be able to retaliate or deal with the prehistoric magical beasts if they were to face any now. However, Sendros didn't seem to be relaxed at all. Instead, after some inspecting, he looked a little lost and distracted. He subconsciously murmured, The prophecy is true, a big crack has appeared. The disaster is about to strike. Is the darkness shrine really unable to escape the fate of death? The big crack. Does it refer to that? Lin Li thought. Actually, he had already noticed a crack deeper than darkness right below the eternal darkness altar. It seemed to be mocking the world unscrupulously. However, what surprised Lin Li was the familiar aura that he detected in the aura that was coming out of the crack. It seemed to be the aura of the dragon of destruction. While Lin Li was surprised, he was also puzzled. The dragon of destruction in the endless world had already been put into his ring of endless storm, while the dragon of destruction of Amril had already been killed by the immortal king. Its corpse was also used in the construction of the sky castles. In the world of Amril today, the magical crystal of the dragon of destruction that Lin Li held was considered the only trace of the dragon of destruction left. In that case, where did the aura of the dragon of destruction come from? Lin Li had killed the dragon of destruction in the endless world, and fought against the projected avatar of the Lord of Darkness in the abyss of Tharlan. He had also been trying to incubate the magical crystal of the dragon of destruction. Hence, he was extremely familiar with the aura of the dragon of destruction. So much so that it would be impossible for him to make a mistake in identifying it. However, regardless of which perspective he considered it from, he couldn't imagine what the origin of the aura of the dragon of destruction in the crack would be. However, regardless of what the source might be, it definitely was a strong and formidable existence since it could have the same aura as the dragon of destruction. However, that happened in another world, and back then, Lin Li also had all 7 pieces of the debris of the stars and the stars of fury. It was also because of the battle with the dragon of destruction that Lin Li got a clearer idea of how terrifyingly powerful the dragon of destruction was as the dragon aspect of Amril. Its power was enough for it to dominate all entities with power above the sanctuary realm. In fact, it wouldn't be inferior to real deities either. When Lin Li was feeling bewildered about the aura of the dragon of destruction, Sendros had already snapped out of his trance, and dared not delay any more. Hence, he immediately commanded the 5 high priests and several other priests to do their best to reinforce the seal of the eternal darkness altar. Sendros had no idea how much time the seal would buy for them, but he decided to leave it up to fate. Lin Li couldn't help much in reinforcing the seal, and all he could do was stay near the crack to watch and observe. At the same time, he was also still thinking about the aura of the dragon of destruction. Under the instructions and commands of Sendros, the 5 high priests and the other priests continuously surrounded the eternal darkness altar, and tried to repair the damage of the seal. With the movement of the people, the eternal darkness altar gradually stopped shaking, and the surging aura of darkness that had filled the entire eternal darkness altar also gradually converged, and was absorbed by the magic array on the eternal darkness altar. However, at this moment, the view below the crack that was about to be resealed was also revealed. Lin Li, who was standing in front of the crack that was slowly closing, could see that there were countless minotaurs and the 3-headed manticores that they were riding, just like Sendros described. The minotaurs were all large and tall, and they looked much stronger than the giants of Amril. They each had a bull's head and a human body. The giant axes that they were holding looked just like 2 doors put together. Seeing the axes, Lin Li finally realized how the deep grooves in the square in front of the darkness shrine had come about. The 3-headed manticores that they were riding were also much stronger than the ones that Lin Li had seen in the past. Otherwise, it wouldn't be enough to carry the tall and heavy minotaurs and their giant axes. It was no wonder that the darkness shrine would be defeated. If such a force were to be placed in Amril, it would be the end of the world. The strongest wall that humans could build probably wouldn't endure a strike from their axes, and even the most elite warrior of mankind would have to succumb helplessly to them. However, when Lin Li glanced at the minotaurs, he was surprised to see a somewhat familiar figure amongst them. At the instant that he did, someone, or rather a certain dragon, surfaced in his mind. Tutankhamun? The familiar figure in the crack turned out to be exactly the same as Tutankhamun in terms of appearance. When the figure revealed its face, Lin Li was beyond astonished because it was exactly identical to Tutankhamun's. However, isn't Tutankhamun in the Blackstone Mountains? Why is he here in the space-time rift? At that moment, the figure in the space-time rift seemed to have also seen Lin Li, who was standing in front of the crack. All of a sudden, a strange smile appeared on his face, and a voice surfaced in Lin Li's mind. Seems like you have seen my incompetent younger brother. Upon hearing the voice, Lin Li seemed to have found the answers to his doubts, and everything suddenly became clear at this moment. Lin Li remembered something that Kanoris had mentioned. After the immortal king killed the Dragon of Destruction and obtained the magical crystal of the Dragon of Destruction, he used his mental strength to incubate the magical crystal into a pair of twins. Tutankhamun was one of them, and so the one in the crack was the other. However, Lin Li still did not understand why Tutankhamun's brother seemed to know him even though they had never met before. Lin Li thought, he even knows that I've seen Tutankhamun? Judging from his tone when he mentioned Tutankhamun, it seems that the two of them are not close to each other. In that case, Tutankhamun probably wouldn't specifically tell him anything. What does Tutankhamun's brother have to do with the disappearance of High Priest Rog? Just as Lin Li was getting more and more doubtful, the voice surfaced in his mind again. I know you have a lot of questions. If you want to know the answers, set me free from this damned place. Seems like this guy is indeed sealed in this crack. No wonder High Priest Rog would use the power of the entire Eternal Darkness altar to suppress it. After all, he is a direct descendant of the Dragon of Destruction, and the Wyrms and Anril are far from comparable to it. Even if he doesn't have half of the Dragon of Destruction's power, it definitely can't be sealed easily. After hearing his words, Lin Li hesitated a little, but soon smiled again. It turned out that he really had to leap into the crack. He said to the figure, yes, I really want to know the answers, but I'm sorry. If I set you free, I might cause trouble for my friends, so I have to come in myself. Lin Li was indeed putting himself in danger, but it wasn't an impulsive decision. The figure was very strong, and there were numerous minotaurs and three-headed manticores on the left and right, but Lin Li was certain that they were definitely unable to exert their full power, since they were being suppressed by High Priest Rog's seal. On the contrary, releasing them would be a true disaster. Without the suppression of the seal, Lin Li wouldn't be able to save his own life, let alone get any answers. As Lin Li entered the crack, Sendros and the rest who were outside the Eternal Darkness altar were dumbfounded. The distinguished guest from the Tower of Dusk, who was likely to be the incarnation of the God of Darkness, actually broke into the crack. That was not a laughing matter at all. They had already guessed that the disappearance of High Priest Rog was probably related to the large crack, and although Lin Li was not weak, how could he compare to High Priest Rog? All of a sudden, everyone froze, and all eyes were focused on Sendros, who was also in a state of confusion at this time. They didn't know if they should continue to strengthen the seal, because that would mean that Lin Li would be sealed too. However, if they did not continue, the prehistoric magical beasts would probably continue to break through the seal if Lin Li couldn't defeat them. Lin Li had no way of knowing what was going on outside. Although it looked like a crack from outside, it was actually like a gate. However, when he actually walked in, he discovered that there was a long and endless space-time tunnel which reminded him of the teleportation portal in the Sky Castle. Outside of the tunnel was a void storm that seemed to be erupting from time to time, moving quickly and sweeping everything in its path. Fortunately, there was a clear direction, and it was not confusing like the chaos of space-time. Lin Li did not hesitate at all, and immediately used his power of flight to fly to the end of the tunnel. However, he had to fly for a long time, despite his rapid speed, before finally seeing the different view hidden at the end of it. When Lin Li finally arrived at another end of the passage, an extremely desolate world appeared in front of him. He seemed to be standing at the opening of a volcano, without any greenery or signs of life around him, and the entire space seemed to have fallen into destructive silence. The volcano was tall, and Lin Li felt like he was standing in the sky when he stood on it. There were various minotaurs beneath the volcano, riding the three-headed manticores. There were also countless giant eyeballs supported by tentacles around the manticores. They were the evil eyes that Lin Li had once seen using the time-space beacon. However, none of them seemed to be an evil eye tyrant. The figure who claimed to be Tutankhamun's older brother was standing on the other side of the crater. right opposite Lin Li. He seemed to be rather surprised by Lin Li's decision to barge in. He indeed looked identical to Tutankhamun, but he was giving off a menacing, destructive, and evil aura which Lin Li did not detect from Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was a mysterious hermit, and the one in front of him was undoubtedly the king of evilness and destruction. Yes, that's it, this is the aura of the Dragon of Destruction, and this is the descendant of the Dragon of Destruction. Lin Li could clearly feel that the destructive aura of the figure before him was exactly the same as that of the Dragon of Destruction in his memory. Although Tutankhamun, who he had seen before, also had powerful abilities, he had never been able to associate Tutankhamun with the Dragon of Destruction. Had Kanoris not mentioned it, Lin Li wouldn't have believed that Tutankhamun was a descendant of the Dragon of Destruction. Staring at the figure that looked more like the descendant of the Dragon of Destruction than Tutankhamun did, Lin Li did not dare to let his guard down at all. Even though he had barged into the big crack, and seemed to be oblivious to the dangers within, he had already condensed all of his mental strength as if he was laying a big net around him as soon as he entered. Any and all changes would be detected by him. At this moment, he had already converged all of the mana fluctuations within him, and while he seemed to be extremely calm, he was already in the best state for casting, hence, he could unleash his strongest combat power at any time. Lin Li was bold but not arrogant. Otherwise, he would have long died during the various near-death experiences that he had had in the past few years in Amril. Back in the Endless World, Lin Li had dealt with the real Dragon of Destruction. Although he had had the Stars of Fury and all 7 pieces of the debris of the stars, and also seized the opportunity to strike when the Dragon of Destruction had been weak, it still had been the most difficult and thrilling battle he had had so far, although he was not facing the actual Dragon of Destruction now, but only a descendant of it. Lin Li was not as invincible as he had been in the Endless World, and he didn't have the Stars of Fury and all 7 pieces of the debris of the stars either. Even the powerhouses of the Sanctuary Realm would be worried and alert when dealing with the prehistoric magical beasts that were above the legendary level, let alone Lin Li, a level 23 legendary mage. Lin Li didn't want to be a hero, and although he had some ties with Sendros, their relationship alone was not significant enough for him to put himself in danger for the sake of saving the Darkness Shrine. In fact, if there had been other options, Lin Li would never have put himself in danger by gambling like this. As long as he could get what he wanted, he wouldn't mind letting the beasts out and ruining the Darkness Shrine again. However, Lin Li was very clear that those beasts that had been sealed for countless years often went back on their word and would say one thing, only to do another. Even though that figure sounded rather nice, Lin Li knew that the beasts would become dominant over him once he released them. How could Tutankhamun's brother possibly talk things out with him calmly? Would he even answer Lin Li's questions? Hence, unless Lin Li didn't want to find out about anything, he definitely had to enter the crack. Besides, even if he didn't release them now, they wouldn't stay in the crack for long according to Sendro's hunch. By then, there would be no need to say anything. Of course, Lin Li did not think that Tutankhamun's brother would be intimidated by his bravery in barging in and then blurt out everything he knew. Lin Li knew very well that no matter where he was, he would have to show his powers and prove himself to be strong enough in order to assert dominance. Otherwise, he would have to be suppressed by others. He reckoned that Tutankhamun's brother had to know about that too. In order to get an answer from him, Lin Li would probably have to give him something in exchange too. Hence, a battle would definitely be inevitable now that he had barged in. However, what surprised Lin Li a little was the fact that Tutankhamun's brother, the descendant of the Dragon of Destruction, did not seem to have any intention to attack Lin Li, even though he was surprised to see that he had barged in. Instead, he smiled faintly, and said in a calm tone, "I reckon you probably guessed my identity. Yes, I am the other son of Azardas, the Dragon of Destruction. I'm Tutankhamun's brother. You may call me Nifa." Lin Li didn't find his tone hostile, and he even felt that there was a touch of friendliness in his tone. However, that was also precisely why he dared not relax at all. In this world, there were many who pretended to be sincere about being friends and forging a strong friendship while stabbing their friends in the back. Lin Li was no longer a child, hence, he wouldn't believe others easily. Besides, he could tell from the current situation that the conflict between them wouldn't be mediated or solved easily, because he wanted to find out some secrets without releasing Nifa, while Nifa wanted to leave. You actually know that I have seen Tutankhamun before? Lin Li asked, since Nifa didn't seem to have the intention to attack him immediately. However, he didn't put down the Helios scepter, which still contained plenty of mana that never decreased at all. It seemed that it would be able to cast powerful legendary-level magic spells anytime. Nifa didn't seem to care much about Lin Li's attitude, and he still had a smile on his face, though it was unknown if it was genuine or not. He glanced at Lin Li's hand, and said, "Isn't that ring on your finger the Evil Eye Tyrant's magical crystal that is one of the 3 treasures that Juresco got my brother to safeguard? Since you already have it, you've definitely met Tutankhamun." Nifa's explanation seemed to be rather reasonable, but Lin Li didn't believe it. He could not have seen the ring on Lin Li's hand through the big crack even with good eyesight. Besides, the Evil Eye Tyrant magical crystal had been made into a ring, and it definitely wouldn't be easily recognized. Lin Li reckoned that Nifa probably had some special connection with Tutankhamun since they were both hatched from the same dragon crystal. Even human twins had a telepathic connection, what more the descendants of the Dragon of Destruction. The first question was answered in a perfunctory manner. Although it was not an important matter, Lin Li was even more certain that the conversation probably wouldn't proceed smoothly. Even if Nifa didn't attack, Lin Li would have to show his prowess if he couldn't get the answers that he wanted. It was not that Lin Li was arrogant. After all, he still had 5 pieces of the debris of the stars, and he could even use the summoning scroll to summon all of them. By then, Nifa might be the one to be defeated. However, the conversation had just begun. Since Nifa refused to say anything, Lin Li decided not to ask about such insignificant things. Instead, he exclaimed with a look of derision, "Oh, is that so?" Although Lin Li's attitude was not exactly harsh, everyone could tell that it wasn't pleasant. However, Nifa seemed to be completely indifferent and unaffected. He was still smiling and speaking in a tone that was full of evilness and destructive aura, just as if he were just having a casual conversation. He calmly said, "Since you already have the magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant, you must be the one Juresco has selected. Since my brother handed it to you, he should be considered to have completed the agreement with Juresco. Can you tell me how he is now? You even know that I've seen him before. How could you not know how he's doing?" Although Lin Li was displeased with Nifa's question, he didn't show his emotions. After all, he still had some things to find out from Nifa, and it wouldn't be good to make the situation too tense too early into the conversation. He watched Nifa's actions carefully, and coldly said, "Of course, he's enjoying more freedom in the Blackstone Mountains than you are here." "Freedom?" Nifa chuckled and shook his head slightly before continuing in disdain, "It's been so many years, but he hasn't grown at all. Despite being the son of the Dragon of Destruction, he's actually willing to stoop so low as to live in the Blackstone Mountains. I really don't know what to say about him." Actually, Lin Li, too, found it strange that Tutankhamun was guarding the Blackstone Mountains. He was still the mighty son of the Dragon of Destruction, after all, not the adopted son of the immortal king. Was he really going to stay in the Blackstone Mountains for more than 1,000 years just because of the bet with Juresco? That was clearly abnormal. However, although Lin Li was curious, he did not ask Nifa about it directly. Instead, he jibed in a hostile manner, "In that case, what do you think you should do in order to live up to your status as a descendant of the Dragon of Destruction?" Given Nifa's current predicament, it was obvious what Lin Li meant. At least, Tutankhamun wasn't sealed in a space-time rift, and was allowed to breathe the fresh air of Amril and enjoy the vast sunlight. Meanwhile, Nifa, who continuously called Tutankhamun incompetent, could only live in purgatory in this barren world. Although the remark was sarcastic, Nifa wasn't infuriated, and it was as if he didn't catch the hidden meaning at all. Instead, he answered, "As a descendant of the dragon aspect, I ought to dominate the entire world of Amril and stand on the very top to look down on the world beneath me. I shouldn't be one of the ordinary beings. Haven't you heard this saying before? The higher you climb, the harder you fall." "Be careful not to fall to your death," Lin Li retorted sarcastically. The dragon aspect was indeed a supreme existence in the world, but the dragon of destruction, Azardas, had been slaughtered twice, that was in both worlds. If it weren't for the death of the dragon of destruction, Tutankhamun and Nifa wouldn't have existed, and no one could be sure that he wouldn't have the same fate as his father even if were to become the new dragon of destruction. So, do you stop climbing upwards just because you're worried about falling? To the ordinary people, don't you stand at the height where they would look up to? The sanctuary realm is probably your goal now, right? As a descendant of the dragon aspect, he actually chose to be ordinary and live in the Blackstone Mountains. That's choosing to succumb and abandon the soul brand in his soul that symbolizes the glory of the dragon aspect, Nifa said calmly, not infuriated by Lin Li's word at all. It was as if he were just debating with a friend. However, his behavior made Lin Li secretly keep his guard up. As a descendant of the dragon of destruction, Nifa definitely mastered the laws of destruction and evilness. Yet, he still pretended to have a good temper, and if weren't for Lin Li's good manners, he would have thought that he had the upper hand. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.